Here's something you've probably heard a lot of in the last few months. Russia is running out of tanks. But while this refrain was once something of a joke, now, more than half a year into the invasion of Ukraine, it looks like a new reality, and you won't believe how bad it's gotten. As of August 2023, the numbers are truly staggering. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia has lost an estimated 4,330 tanks and 8,400 armored combat vehicles, not to mention over 250,000 soldiers. While these numbers are likely inflated to some degree, anything even close to these figures represents most of the country's pre-war supply of armor and will have long-lasting implications for both Russia and the international community. Similarly, a recent open-source investigation by Norwegian researcher Ragnar Gudmundsson shows that Russia is definitely relying on more and more older tanks. He found that in the first days of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, 71% of the lost tanks accounted for vehicles modernized or produced in the Russian Federation, and just 29% were Soviet-era models. However, as of June 2023, it was a very different situation. 73% of lost Russian tanks originated from the Soviet Union, while only 27% were newer types. This strongly suggests that Russian tank supplies have reached a tipping point, where they can no longer be replaced. It could also change the dynamics of this grinding conflict, potentially signaling that the Russian war effort is finally running out of steam. So let's dive into how this happened and just what it means for the future of the war in Ukraine. Alright, let's circle back to Putin's ongoing battle to hang on to his tanks. And honestly, by now, there's no surprises here. This guy's lack of skill is starting to feel like an endless saga. Reports over the summer have confirmed that Russian tank losses are so heavy that the country has moved many of its ancient Soviet tanks out of storage. This includes the T-54 and T-55, which are more than 75 years old and essentially obsolete in today's combat environments. Back when it made its battlefield debut, the T-55 was a highly effective tank, but it entered service just after the Second World War, soon becoming one of the most highly produced tanks ever, with an estimated 100,000 built over the next few decades. As a result, the T-55 played a role in just about every single conflict during the Cold War period, and frightened Western countries so much that they rushed to mass-produce their own battle tanks. It was also built to survive just about anything, with a massive 205mm of frontal turret armor and 120mm of slanted hull armor. This armor is so tough that the tank itself survived tests with a 15-kiloton nuclear explosion at only 300 meters away. The T-55 also has a 100mm gun, which was once a threat to anything in the NATO arsenal. But that was the 1950s. Today's modern tank systems make the T-55 look like junk, and there is little question which would prevail in a head-to-head battle. That's not to mention that T-55s also included a so-called jack-in-the-box flaw, which has doomed many of Russia's other Soviet-era tanks. Unlike modern battle tanks such as the German Leopard 2 or US M1 Abrams, which keep their shells away from the crew behind thick armored walls, older Soviet tanks store their ammunition in a carousel-style automatic loader sitting directly below the main turret and crew. A well-placed shot to their thin roof armor can ignite the ammunition and easily blow up the tank. As Professor Robert E. Hamilton of the US Army War College put it bluntly, for a Russian crew, if the ammo storage compartment is hit, everyone is dead. He adds that the force of the explosion will instantaneously vaporize anyone unlucky enough to be inside. So why has Russia been forced to rely on these death trap antiques? And what in the world happened to all its decent tanks? The short answer is that Ukraine happened. The long answer is that years of poor combat doctrine and failure to learn from past mistakes have made Ukraine's stunning success much easier than anyone predicted. Russia's initial offensive into the country last year was nothing short of a disaster, with endless strategic and tactical blunders, and ineffective approaches to modern urban and semi-urban combat. This was reflected strongly in the performance of its tank units. Battle tanks are one of the most effective and critical weapons in modern warfare. While jets and bombers are more destructive, they cannot be used to hold and control territory in the same way that a tank can. The main gun of a tank can pin down enemies and even level buildings. Some tanks have specialized rounds intended to do just that. Composite tank armor is also incredibly tough, using layers and structural reinforcement to stop anything short of another tank blast or very well-placed missile. And anything a tank is able to blow apart, it can also roll over, making most low cover ineffective. But for all their power, tanks can easily be stopped without proper support. Russia has continually failed to learn this lesson, which helps account for the abysmal performance of its tanks in Ukraine. And by taking advantage of this reality, Ukrainian defenders were able to pull off some of their most astonishing victories of the war. But while this has become obvious to most observers since February 2022, Russia's failure to properly utilize its tanks actually has quite an embarrassing history. For instance, during the First Chechen War of 1994 to 1996, Russia mobilized its enormous arsenal of Soviet tanks to try and crush the smaller and less equipped Chechen forces. But as Russian troops discovered all the way back then, superior numbers and equipment don't mean very much when executed badly. Lacking their own tanks, Chechen rebels instead relied on anti-tank missiles, RPGs, tank mines, and even improvised explosive devices. Much as Ukraine has, they also use this limited toolkit to take advantage of major weaknesses in Russian warfighting doctrine. This doctrine relies on tanks leading the way of every ground assault, with infantry fighting vehicles behind providing close support. But the usefulness of infantry support is greatly diminished when troops are stuck inside vehicles, leaving them unable to detect ambushes or respond quickly. In Chechnya, rebels took advantage of this by fighting in urban environments and using guerrilla tactics to fire from many positions at once. Firing from above also allows them to target the thin armor on the tank's roofs, often resulting in devastating ambushes. Russia's enormous casualties from a tank-heavy warfighting doctrine with no effective infantry support would be repeated during the Second Chechen War only years later. Russia was able to secure eventual victory in both these conflicts by using brutal artillery strikes and the huge size of its armed forces to seize and hold the capital Grozny. But the wars showed some fundamental weaknesses which many people failed to pay attention to. As Olga Oleka, an analyst from the RAND Corporation, wrote way back in 2001 that failure to prepare for urban combat was a key error the Russians made in both Chechnya wars, but it was far from the only one. Hampered by poor training and supplies, decrepit equipment, and abysmal planning, the 1994–96 war presented a stark picture of how much this once great force had deteriorated. It also demonstrated how poorly the Russian military organizational structures functioned when disparate forces were called upon to work together. Sound familiar? It should, because today not a single one of these underlying issues had been addressed. Throughout the early 21st century, Russian combat doctrine continually relied on heavy tanks without adequate infantry support, counting on the use of superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm smaller enemies. Issues with training, supplies, equipment, and planning were never addressed, while Putin's kleptocratic dictatorship funneled huge chunks of the military budget into oligarchs' bank accounts. Fast forward to 2022, and it's pretty easy to see how the invasion of Ukraine was a disaster waiting to happen. Ukraine is far bigger than Chechnya, while its military is just as fiercely determined and tactically flexible as the rebels were. Ukrainian war planners also took advantage of the same weaknesses, drawing Russian forces into built-up urban areas where their tanks were highly vulnerable and unleashing extremely effective ambushes. This was obvious during the first weeks of the invasion, where Russian tank columns rolling into Kyiv were stopped in their tracks by Ukrainian ambushes. As armor and troops poured into the country, General Colonel Oleksandr Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's ground forces, determined that the Russian columns would need to advance along 2 or 3 major highways to enter Kyiv in their blitzkrieg attack. So Syrsky organized 2 rings of troops to defend the city, one in the outer suburbs and one in the capital, with as much space between them as possible, in order to minimize damage to infrastructure. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv, allowing them to easily target the highways and saving them from Russian airstrikes. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv. This strategy proved to be extremely effective, allowing defenders to destroy many of the slow-moving tanks. Videos like this now famous 45-second clip released by Ukraine's defense ministry showed entire companies of Russian armor being destroyed in deadly ambushes by Ukrainian hit-and-run teams, using anti-tank guided missiles or ATGMs. As Russian columns rolled through built-up urban areas in long, strung out with no infantry support, they were devastated by such barrages. This was even clearer later on. For instance, during the battle for the small town of Volodar. In early 2023, Ukraine placed hundreds of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines in the fields outside the town. Due to the flat landscape and lack of cover, any Russian minesweepers were immediately targeted with artillery fire. Ukrainian troops left corridors between the mined fields, only large enough for 2 or 3 Russian tanks at a time to roll through. If the tanks moved at all from the cleared path, they risked having their treads blown off, leaving them totally exposed to artillery strikes. When Russian commanders predictably ordered their tanks to lead the assault along these unmined paths outside Volodar, it left them incredibly vulnerable to the same type of ambushes Ukrainians have deployed since the start of the invasion. Hiding in covered positions near the tank columns, Ukrainian hunter-killer teams set up anti-tank missiles on both sides of the kill zone. Without triggering the anti-tank mines, these teams were able to cross the minefields and dig themselves into strategic positions, often hiding in bushes or abandoned buildings. From there they could fire and retreat with little fear of being hit by tank fire. Much like Chechen rebels, Ukrainians also used building rooftops and windows to target the weakly armored top sections of tanks. Because Russia refused to dismount their infantry to avoid them getting shot, this left them completely unable to fight back. But unlike Chechen rebels, Ukrainian troops have also had the advantage of modern ATGMs, which they have used to incredible effect against Russian armor. These include everything from the more basic Ukrainian-manufactured Stugna P to advanced Western-produced systems like the Javelin, Next-Generation Light Anti-Tank Weapon or NLAW, and AT-4. These 4 ATGMs have accounted for the majority of Russia's tank losses during the invasion, providing Ukrainians with a highly cost-effective way of handling tank columns. As a result, in just one 3-week period, Russia lost over 130 tanks and armored vehicles in Volodar, forcing Putin to rely on human wave-style infantry assaults to try and take the position. And in other battles during the war, Russia did actually dismount its infantry troops, but poor training and equipment meant that they failed to properly scan the flanks. When the ambushes began, many Russian soldiers also panicked, leading to a breakdown in the chain of command and chaotic, disorganized retreats. Infantry fled and tried to find cover wherever possible. In some places, Russian soldiers were even rolled over by their own armor. Footage from a later battle at Volodar, shared on Telegram earlier this year, showed 2 Russian soldiers being dragged under a retreating tank, and a soldier covered in flames running from a tank shortly before it exploded. Complete disasters like this are only possible with badly trained troops, as one of the earliest lessons taught in any effective infantry academy is how to react to ambushes by rallying and pushing out of the kill zone. Because Russian infantry have failed to do so, it often hasn't even mattered that they have dismounted to support the tank units. Multiply this by a year and a half of fighting, and it's easy to see why Russia is pulling antiques like the T-55 out of storage and museums. Recent satellite imagery shows that an open-air depot in remote Buryatia in eastern Siberia has lost about 40% of all tanks and armored vehicles it had previously been housing. This is Russia's largest known tank depot, suggesting that others may be even more depleted. And with every passing month, the Russian military fields increasingly less capable tanks as they cannot replace their losses. International sanctions mean they cannot obtain the advanced parts necessary to build more modern armor, such as the T-90 or T-14 Armata. It's also unclear how many tanks Russia was able to produce even before the invasion. Some Russian sources say that one of its largest tank production plants was capable of pumping out 20 a month, with others claiming slightly less. The country also has 2 new plants under construction, but even so, its production cannot compare to the staggering losses of more than 150 a month in Ukraine. And anything actually coming off the line in Russia is now certainly not modern. Sanctions mean no modern electronics for targeting or specialized kits like thermal vision. They even affect things as basic as ball bearings, which are crucial to the production of modern vehicles. Before the war, Russia received some 55% of ball bearings from Europe, Canada, and the US. These deficiencies make producing anything more advanced than a T-80 essentially impossible, seriously diminishing the future potential of Russian armor as a whole. Unable to obtain modern parts, Russia has resorted to pushing tanks off the line with only gunners' sights, reducing the range of their guns by almost 1.5 miles. That type of distance seriously matters against something like a Leopard 2 or M1 Abrams. Russian tanks will essentially have to engage in close-quarters combat hoping that they can gain the element of surprise against superior Ukrainian firepower. Needless to say, this will result in even greater losses of armor and soldiers, creating a vicious cycle of decreased production and increased costs. Very few governments could sustain wartime production in such an environment, and Putin's government, as the last few years have shown us, is anything but effective or competent. This is especially true due to the economic strain and enormous costs imposed by the destruction of tanks and other materiel. During the first months of 2023, Russia blew through its entire defense budget for the year, and there are no indications that new sources of revenue are opening up. European price caps on Russian oil, import bans, and corruption and inefficiency in Russia's massive oil sector mean that this year it will be lucky to break even. This is a disaster for the country's wider economy, since the Russian oil and natural gas sector has historically been its most economically powerful, accounting for 20% of its pre-war GDP and 45% of its monthly budget. Adding to the economic pain is the fact that Russia is now taxing its domestic oil industry based on Brent crude prices, rather than its own energy prices, meaning energy companies in Russia are paying taxes on revenue that cannot even be generated. In the best case, this scenario will leave the country's oil market breaking even, meaning its funds cannot be used to subsidize the production of new tanks or any other military hardware. Long story short, there really is no effective path for Russia to keep its production of tanks going long-term, all while its embarrassingly bad combat doctrine and lack of modern technology ensures that steep losses on the battlefield will continue. While Ukraine has far less capability to produce its own tanks, that won't matter nearly as much if it continues to receive aid from the West. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently confirmed that more than 98% of the combat vehicles promised to Ukraine have already been delivered, and that means over 1,550 armored vehicles, 230 tanks and other equipment, including vast amounts of ammunition. In total, we have trained and equipped more than 9 new Ukrainian armored brigades. This will put Ukraine in a strong position to continue to retake occupied territory. Whether these are followed up by more tanks and armored infantry vehicles later this year or in 2024 likely depends on Ukraine's performance in its slowly ramping up counteroffensive, as well as continued international political support for Ukraine. There is little question that even the current supply of tanks will pose a massive challenge to Russia's ability to hold on to its occupied territory. But it is also a matter of more than just firepower. The UK Ministry of Defence recently wrote that Russia has constructed some of the most extensive systems of military defensive networks seen anywhere in the world for many decades, not just near the current front lines, but also deep inside areas Russia currently controls. Intelligence reports and satellite imagery show a particular effort to fortify the northern border of Crimea with a multi-layered defensive zone built up around the village of Medvedevka, including minefields designed to force Ukraine into a choke point. All of this indicates that Russian field commanders are at least now aware that their own losses are a serious issue, and that Ukraine's modern tanks will likely win in any head-to-head engagement. Because of this, the coming months of the war may become a standoff, with Ukraine unable to penetrate Russia's defensive positions, but Russia unable to launch another tank offensive for fear of losing its now limited supplies. In the end, as with many wars, the future of this conflict will most likely be determined by attrition. Whichever side can outlast the other will be able to gain the upper hand, especially in the critical area of tank warfare. Russia's experience so far shows that it never dealt with the long-standing issues present in its military and economy, something which has only been accelerated after a year and a half of war and sanctions. Its enormous tank losses certainly seem unsustainable, but only time will tell if they ultimately tip the balance of power in favor of Ukraine. But what do you think? Will Russian tank losses prove to be a deciding factor in the conflict, or will Russia be able to overcome its issues and keep Ukraine's counteroffensive from achieving success? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. Here's something you've probably heard a lot of in the last few months. Russia is running out of tanks. But while this refrain was once something of a joke, now, more than half a year into the invasion of Ukraine, it looks like a new reality, and you won't believe how bad it's gotten. As of August 2023, the numbers are truly staggering. According to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Russia has lost an estimated 4,330 tanks and 8,400 armored combat vehicles, not to mention over 250,000 soldiers. While these numbers are likely inflated to some degree, anything even close to these figures represents most of the country's pre-war supply of armor and will have long-lasting implications for both Russia and the international community. Similarly, a recent open-source investigation by Norwegian researcher Ragnar Gudmundsson shows that Russia is definitely relying on more and more older tanks. He found that in the first days of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, 71% of the lost tanks accounted for vehicles modernized or produced in the Russian Federation, and just 29% were Soviet-era models. However, as of June 2023, it was a very different situation. 73% of lost Russian tanks originated from the Soviet Union, while only 27% were newer types. This strongly suggests that Russian tank supplies have reached a tipping point, where they can no longer be replaced. It could also change the dynamics of this grinding conflict, potentially signaling that the Russian war effort is finally running out of steam. So let's dive into how this happened and just what it means for the future of the war in Ukraine. Alright, let's circle back to Putin's ongoing battle to hang on to his tanks. And honestly, by now, there's no surprises here. This guy's lack of skill is starting to feel like an endless saga. Reports over the summer have confirmed that Russian tank losses are so heavy that the country has moved many of its ancient Soviet tanks out of storage. This includes the T-54 and T-55, which are more than 75 years old and essentially obsolete in today's combat environments. Back when it made its battlefield debut, the T-55 was a highly effective tank, but it entered service just after the Second World War, soon becoming one of the most highly produced tanks ever, with an estimated 100,000 built over the next few decades. As a result, the T-55 played a role in just about every single conflict during the Cold War period, and frightened Western countries so much that they rushed to mass-produce their own battle tanks. It was also built to survive just about anything, with a massive 205mm of frontal turret armor and 120mm of slanted hull armor. This armor is so tough that the tank itself survived tests with a 15-kiloton nuclear explosion at only 300 meters away. The T-55 also has a 100mm gun, which was once a threat to anything in the NATO arsenal. But that was the 1950s. Today's modern tank systems make the T-55 look like junk, and there is little question which would prevail in a head-to-head battle. That's not to mention that T-55s also included a so-called jack-in-the-box flaw, which has doomed many of Russia's other Soviet-era tanks. Unlike modern battle tanks such as the German Leopard 2 or US M1 Abrams, which keep their shells away from the crew behind thick armored walls, older Soviet tanks store their ammunition in a carousel-style automatic loader sitting directly below the main turret and crew. A well-placed shot to their thin roof armor can ignite the ammunition and easily blow up the tank. As Professor Robert E. Hamilton of the US Army War College put it bluntly, for a Russian crew, if the ammo storage compartment is hit, everyone is dead. He adds that the force of the explosion will instantaneously vaporize anyone unlucky enough to be inside. So why has Russia been forced to rely on these death trap antiques, and what in the world happened to all its decent tanks? The short answer is that Ukraine happened. The long answer is that years of poor combat doctrine and failure to learn from past mistakes have made Ukraine's stunning success much easier than anyone predicted. Russia's initial offensive into the country last year was nothing short of a disaster, with endless strategic and tactical blunders, and ineffective approaches to modern urban and semi-urban combat. This was reflected strongly in the performance of its tank units. Battle tanks are one of the most effective and critical weapons in modern warfare. While jets and bombers are more destructive, they cannot be used to hold and control territory in the same way that a tank can. The main gun of a tank can pin down enemies and even level buildings. Some tanks have specialized rounds intended to do just that. Composite tank armor is also incredibly tough, using layers and structural reinforcement to stop anything short of another tank blast or very well-placed missile. And anything a tank is able to blow apart, it can also roll over, making most low cover ineffective. But for all their power, tanks can easily be stopped without proper support. Russia has continually failed to learn this lesson, which helps account for the abysmal performance of its tanks in Ukraine. And by taking advantage of this reality, Ukrainian defenders were able to pull off some of their most astonishing victories of the war. But while this has become obvious to most observers since February 2022, Russia's failure to properly utilize its tanks actually has quite an embarrassing history. For instance, during the First Chechen War of 1994 to 1996, Russia mobilized its enormous arsenal of Soviet tanks to try and crush the smaller and less equipped Chechen forces. But as Russian troops discovered all the way back then, superior numbers and equipment don't mean very much when executed badly. Lacking their own tanks, Chechen rebels instead relied on anti-tank missiles, RPGs, tank mines, and even improvised explosive devices. Much as Ukraine has, they also use this limited toolkit to take advantage of major weaknesses in Russian warfighting doctrine. This doctrine relies on tanks leading the way of every ground assault, with infantry fighting vehicles behind providing close support. But the usefulness of infantry support is greatly diminished when troops are stuck inside vehicles, leaving them unable to detect ambushes or respond quickly. In Chechnya, rebels took advantage of this by fighting in urban environments and using guerrilla tactics to fire from many positions at once. Firing from above also allows them to target the thin armor on the tank's roofs, often resulting in devastating ambushes. Russia's enormous casualties from a tank-heavy warfighting doctrine with no effective infantry support would be repeated during the Second Chechen War only years later. Russia was able to secure eventual victory in both these conflicts by using brutal artillery strikes and the huge size of its armed forces to seize and hold the capital Grozny. But the wars showed some fundamental weaknesses which many people failed to pay attention to. As Olga Oleka, an analyst from the RAND Corporation, wrote way back in 2001 that failure to prepare for urban combat was a key error the Russians made in both Chechnya wars, but it was far from the only one. Hampered by poor training and supplies, decrepit equipment, and abysmal planning, the 1994–96 war presented a stark picture of how much this once great force had deteriorated. It also demonstrated how poorly the Russian military organizational structures functioned when disparate forces were called upon to work together. Sound familiar? It should, because today not a single one of these underlying issues had been addressed. Throughout the early 21st century, Russian combat doctrine continually relied on heavy tanks without adequate infantry support, counting on the use of superior numbers and firepower to overwhelm smaller enemies. Issues with training, supplies, equipment, and planning were never addressed, while Putin's kleptocratic dictatorship funneled huge chunks of the military budget into oligarchs' bank accounts. Fast forward to 2022, and it's pretty easy to see how the invasion of Ukraine was a disaster waiting to happen. Ukraine is far bigger than Chechnya, while its military is just as fiercely determined and tactically flexible as the rebels were. Ukrainian war planners also took advantage of the same weaknesses, drawing Russian forces into built-up urban areas where their tanks were highly vulnerable and unleashing extremely effective ambushes. This was obvious during the first weeks of the invasion, where Russian tank columns rolling into Kyiv were stopped in their tracks by Ukrainian ambushes. As armor and troops poured into the country, General Colonel Alexander Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's ground forces, determined that the Russian columns would need to advance along 2 or 3 major highways to enter Kyiv in their blitzkrieg attack. So Syrsky organized 2 rings of troops to defend the city, one in the outer suburbs and one in the capital, with as much space between them as possible, in order to minimize damage to infrastructure. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv, allowing them to easily target the highways and saving them from Russian airstrikes. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv. This strategy proved to be extremely effective, allowing defenders to destroy many of the slow-moving tanks. Videos like this now famous 45-second clip released by Ukraine's defense ministry showed entire companies of Russian armor being destroyed in deadly ambushes by Ukrainian hit-and-run teams, using anti-tank guided missiles or ATGMs. As Russian columns rolled through built-up urban areas in long, strung out with no infantry support, they were devastated by such barrages. This was even clearer later on. For instance, during the battle for the small town of Volodar. In early 2023, Ukraine placed hundreds of anti-tank and anti-personnel mines in the fields outside the town. Due to the flat landscape and lack of cover, any Russian minesweepers were immediately targeted with artillery fire. Ukrainian troops left corridors between the mined fields, only large enough for 2 or 3 Russian tanks at a time to roll through. If the tanks moved at all from the cleared path, they risked having their treads blown off, leaving them totally exposed to artillery strikes. When Russian commanders predictably ordered their tanks to lead the assault along these unmined paths outside Vuhledar, it left them incredibly vulnerable to the same type of ambushes Ukrainians have deployed since the start of the invasion. Hiding in covered positions near the tank columns, Ukrainian hunter-killer teams set up anti-tank missiles on both sides of the kill zone. Without triggering the anti-tank mines, these teams were able to cross the minefields and dig themselves into strategic positions, often hiding in bushes or abandoned buildings. From there they could fire and retreat with little fear of being hit by tank fire. Much like Chechen rebels, Ukrainians also used building rooftops and windows to target the weakly armored top sections of tanks. Because Russia refused to dismount their infantry to avoid them getting shot, this left them completely unable to fight back. But unlike Chechen rebels, Ukrainian troops have also had the advantage of modern ATGMs, which they have used to incredible effect against Russian armor. These include everything from the more basic Ukrainian-manufactured Stugna P to advanced Western-produced systems like the Javelin, Next-Generation Light Anti-Tank Weapon or NLAW, and AT-4. These 4 ATGMs have accounted for the majority of Russia's tank losses during the invasion, providing Ukrainians with a highly cost-effective way of handling tank columns. As a result, in just one 3-week period, Russia lost over 130 tanks and armored vehicles in Vuhledar, forcing Putin to rely on human wave-style infantry assaults to try and take the position. And in other battles during the war, Russia did actually dismount its infantry troops, but poor training and equipment meant that they failed to properly scan the flanks. When the ambushes began, many Russian soldiers also panicked, leading to a breakdown in the chain of command and chaotic, disorganized retreats. Infantry fled and tried to find cover wherever possible. In some places, Russian soldiers were even rolled over by their own armor. Footage from a later battle at Vuhledar, shared on Telegram earlier this year, showed 2 Russian soldiers being dragged under a retreating tank, and a soldier covered in flames running from a tank shortly before it exploded. Complete disasters like this are only possible with badly trained troops, as one of the earliest lessons taught in any effective infantry academy is how to react to ambushes by rallying and pushing out of the kill zone. Because Russian infantry have failed to do so, it often hasn't even mattered that they have dismounted to support the tank units. Multiply this by a year and a half of fighting, and it's easy to see why Russia is pulling antiques like the T-55 out of storage and museums. Recent satellite imagery shows that an open-air depot in remote Buryatia in eastern Siberia has lost about 40% of all tanks and armored vehicles it had previously been housing. This is Russia's largest known tank depot, suggesting that others may be even more depleted. And with every passing month, the Russian military fields increasingly less capable tanks as they cannot replace their losses. International sanctions mean they cannot obtain the advanced parts necessary to build more modern armor, such as the T-90 or T-14 Armata. It's also unclear how many tanks Russia was able to produce even before the invasion. Some Russian sources say that one of its largest tank production plants was capable of pumping out 20 a month, with others claiming slightly less. The country also has 2 new plants under construction, but even so, its production cannot compare to the staggering losses of more than 150 a month in Ukraine. And anything actually coming off the line in Russia is now certainly not modern. Sanctions mean no modern electronics for targeting or specialized kits like thermal vision. They even affect things as basic as ball bearings, which are crucial to the production of modern vehicles. Before the war, Russia received some 55% of ball bearings from Europe, Canada, and the US. These deficiencies make producing anything more advanced than a T-80 essentially impossible, seriously diminishing the future potential of Russian armor as a whole. Unable to obtain modern parts, Russia has resorted to pushing tanks off the line with only gunners' sights, reducing the range of their guns by almost 1.5 miles. That type of distance seriously matters against something like a Leopard 2 or M1 Abrams. Russian tanks will essentially have to engage in close-quarters combat, hoping that they can gain the element of surprise against superior Ukrainian firepower. Needless to say, this will result in even greater losses of armor and soldiers, creating a vicious cycle of decreased production and increased costs. Very few governments could sustain wartime production in such an environment, and Putin's government, as the last few years have shown us, is anything but effective or competent. This is especially true due to the economic strain and enormous costs imposed by the destruction of tanks and other materiel. During the first months of 2023, Russia blew through its entire defense budget for the year, and there are no indications that new sources of revenue are opening up. European price caps on Russian oil, import bans, and corruption and inefficiency in Russia's massive oil sector mean that this year it will be lucky to break even. This is a disaster for the country's wider economy, since the Russian oil and natural gas sector has historically been its most economically powerful, accounting for 20% of its pre-war GDP and 45% of its monthly budget. Adding to the economic pain is the fact that Russia is now taxing its domestic oil industry based on Brent crude prices, rather than its own energy prices, meaning energy companies in Russia are paying taxes on revenue that cannot even be generated. In the best case, this scenario will leave the country's oil market breaking even, meaning its funds cannot be used to subsidize the production of new tanks or any other military hardware. Long story short, there really is no effective path for Russia to keep its production of tanks going long-term, all while its embarrassingly bad combat doctrine and lack of modern technology ensures that steep losses on the battlefield will continue. While Ukraine has far less capability to produce its own tanks, that won't matter nearly as much if it continues to receive aid from the West. NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg recently confirmed that more than 98% of the combat vehicles promised to Ukraine have already been delivered, and that means over 1,550 armored vehicles, 230 tanks and other equipment, including vast amounts of ammunition. In total, we have trained and equipped more than 9 new Ukrainian armored brigades. This will put Ukraine in a strong position to continue to retake occupied territory. Whether these are followed up by more tanks and armored infantry vehicles later this year or in 2024 likely depends on Ukraine's performance in its slowly ramping up counteroffensive, as well as continued international political support for Ukraine. There is little question that even the current supply of tanks will pose a massive challenge to Russia's ability to hold on to its occupied territory. But it is also a matter of more than just firepower. The UK Ministry of Defence recently wrote that Russia has constructed some of the most extensive systems of military defensive networks seen anywhere in the world for many decades, not just near the current front lines, but also deep inside areas Russia currently controls. Intelligence reports and satellite imagery show a particular effort to fortify the northern border of Crimea with a multi-layered defensive zone built up around the village of Medvedevka, including minefields designed to force Ukraine into a choke point. All of this indicates that Russian field commanders are at least now aware that their own losses are a serious issue, and that Ukraine's modern tanks will likely win in any head-to-head engagement. Because of this, the coming months of the war may become a standoff, with Ukraine unable to penetrate Russia's defensive positions, but Russia unable to launch another tank offensive for fear of losing its now limited supplies. In the end, as with many wars, the future of this conflict will most likely be determined by attrition. Whichever side can outlast the other will be able to gain the upper hand, especially in the critical area of tank warfare. Russia's experience so far shows that it never dealt with the long-standing issues present in its military and economy, something which has only been accelerated after a year and a half of war and sanctions. Its enormous tank losses certainly seem unsustainable, but only time will tell if they ultimately tip the balance of power in favor of Ukraine. But what do you think? Will Russian tank losses prove to be a deciding factor in the conflict, or will Russia be able to overcome its issues and keep Ukraine's counteroffensive from achieving success? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. The US recently announced the next generation of Abrams tank. How would it fare in an out-and-out tank duel with Russia's best? A remote 30mm chain gun, 360-degree panoramic daytime, thermal and laser targeting, smaller crew, modular upgradability, next-generation digital sensors, AI and drone pairing capabilities, parallel diesel and electric power modes, a lethal main gun. Welcome to the AbramsX. After decades of incremental improvements, the 40-year-old battle-proven M1A2 Abrams main battle tank (MBT) is finally set to receive a comprehensive next-generation overhaul. Last October, General Dynamics Land Systems previewed its concept for the AbramsX. In a demonstration featuring a full-scale mock-up laced with futuristic upgrades and design improvements, the new AbramsX offered a glimpse into the future of tank technology. In today's video, we'll see what the newly designed AbramsX improves upon and how it might fare in an out-and-out tank duel against Russia's best offering, the T-14 Armata. American tank technology did not change much during the Cold War. After World War II, the American military relied heavily on its first-generation main battle tanks, the M48 Patton, and its successor, the M60. Both saw heavy service either in NATO or Vietnam. However, by the 1970s, progressive Soviet tank improvements had prompted Western militaries to revisit their decades-old tank design. In the 1960s, the US and West Germany began collaborating on a replacement main battle tank expressly designed to defeat the Soviet T-62. By 1970, their joint project, the MBT-70, had incorporated the latest weapon, engine, and suspension technologies, but the resulting platform was far too heavy and expensive to produce as a whole. The project was eventually scrapped, prompting the US Army to reallocate its remaining funding to develop a viable alternative. This they did. Throughout the 1970s, Chrysler Defense won its competition with General Motors for its M1 prototype, a design that was soon awarded a $20 billion development contract from the Department of Defense. In 1979, the M1 Abrams began rolling off production lines, a revolutionary design with sleek armor, improved targeting, and better cross-country travel capabilities than anything else in its class. General Dynamics purchased Chrysler Defense in the mid-1970s and has continued production of the M1 Abrams to the present day. Costing well over $6 million per unit, over the span of 40 years, General Dynamics has produced more than 10,000 Abrams tanks. Remaining in service for decades after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Abrams racked up an impressive combat record in the Persian Gulf War and subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Admittedly, since the Abrams has never engaged in a tank duel with a vehicle of similar specifications, it's hard to know how it might perform in a fair fight. During the 1991 Gulf War, American M1s destroyed 37 Soviet T-72s, the best enemy tank at the time, while sustaining 0 casualties. It had a comparable, though slightly less, lopsided service record in Iraq. Throughout these conflicts, the Abrams played to its primary strengths, especially its impressive firing range and durability. Able to engage enemy vehicles at more than 2,500 meters, its frontal armor could survive direct armor-piercing rounds fired from other Abrams tanks, while its depleted uranium and British-designed composite ceramic Cobham armor covering the rest of the vehicle kept 4-person crews safe from harm. In the 1990s and 2000s, General Dynamics began producing an upgraded version of the Abrams, the M1A2, a system which made full use of the latest technologies. The M1A2 added thermal night vision imaging capabilities, integrated digital displays with better maps and communications, inter-vehicle information systems, improved cooling, and an overhauled transmission. Starting last year, 2021, the US Army finally began retiring the M1A1 Abrams from service. While the M1A1 is set to become a relic of a bygone era, the US military anticipates keeping its successor, the M1A2, in the ranks until well past 2050, a remarkable testament to the resilience and modularity of the Abrams main battle tank design. But wait, if upgraded M1A1-2 Abrams are forecasted to remain in service for at least 3 more decades, why announce the AbramsX? Well, as the popular song goes, the times, they are a-changing. With the pace of technological change now moving faster than ever, militaries are beginning to unveil the next generation of smart tanks, ones that shoot, move, and communicate on a different plane than their predecessors. The AbramsX is still firmly riding the future war hype train, so we shouldn't get too carried away envisioning its potential role in the American Army of the future. The demonstrator version that debuted on the show floor last October looks like it will capitalize on cutting-edge computer processing, AI, and drone integration technologies, but it will still have to undergo plenty of tests before it's approved for manufacture. Before the AbramsX enters the battlefield, we'll continue to see the current production version of the Abrams tank, the M1A2 System Enhancement Package (SEP) version 3, and its successor currently in development, the M1A2 SEP version 4, for decades to come. So when it finally does enter service, where might the AbramsX diverge from its predecessors? Bristling with a full suite of fancy electronic systems, the AbramsX addresses the 2 biggest complaints leveled at the M1A2: its weight and power. The current Abrams variation weighs in at a whopping 73.6 tons, a number that started at around 60 tons in the first Abrams variant but grew more cumbersome with each successive upgrade. Because of its weight, the Abrams devours an astonishing amount of fuel, 10 gallons just to start the engine, close to 2 gallons per mile, and up to 10 gallons per mile when idling. When you factor in how difficult it is to transport heavy vehicles around the globe and resupply them with that much fuel, shrinking the Abrams' logistical footprint seems like a no-brainer. Carving off the excessive weight, the AbramsX comes in at 60 tons, a feat achieved by moving the crew out of the main turret forward in the tank's hull, adding an autoloader for the main gun, and removing the turret's heavy armor. Some tankies might see the loss of a crew member as a possible weakness in the AbramsX. Sure, the autoloader is nice, but having an extra crew member on board can be a blessing, not a curse. Yes, there's less space, but the extra crew members can help operate secondary and tertiary weapons systems, help repair broken parts, fly drones, deploy countermeasures, or, the far more useful benefit, get chow for the others. Just in case the AbramsX autoloader systems do somehow break down, it's nice to have redundancy. On the subject of the autoloader, we know what you're probably thinking. What about all those Russian T-72s and T-80s in Ukraine whose autoloader turrets give NASA spaceships a run for their money? Don't they just get blown into orbit when they're hit by anti-tank missiles? Won't the AbramsX run into similar problems? It's a fair question. General Dynamics claims that it won't, keeping the Abrams' original ammo storage design, one that relies on a sealed ammunition compartment behind the main turret with blast doors that open only momentarily when loading around. It will avoid the pitfalls of the Russian autoloader variants, which stores their ammo cyclically underneath the turret. With its lighter footprint, the AbramsX draws more from its power plant by replacing the original Abrams turbine engine with a diesel hybrid electric system. Operating in parallel with an advanced Cummins diesel engine, the main power source, a high-powered electric generator provides up to 50% fuel savings over the long run, enabling crews to engage quiet mode on stationary operations without starting the main engine. These batteries also provide a helpful option for exporting power to adjacent units. Apart from these improvements where the AbramsX shines in its upgradability, the AbramsX is fully modular, making use of the Catalyst Next Generation Electronic Architecture (NGEA) that relies heavily on AI for target identification and acquisition, land navigation and path planning, and next-generation situational awareness. The three-man crew is surrounded by a digital interface that offers far more visibility than its predecessors. Their vision gets amplified as crews control adjacent UAVs, robotic ground vehicles, and switchblade drones from the comfort of their bucket seat recliners. The NGEA is fully upgradable as new systems are developed, giving AbramsX space to grow into new roles as battlefield technology evolves. The AbramsX boasts even more lethality than current Abrams models. Even though it retains its original 1200mm main gun, it replaces the traditional 50 caliber turret-mounted exterior machine gun with a fully remote 30mm chain gun. In effect, this transforms the Abrams secondary weapon from an anti-personnel, human-fired machine gun into essentially an M1 Bradley in miniature, one capable of engaging soft and lightly armored targets using programmable airburst munitions. This, General Dynamics claim, will serve as a better response to anti-tank teams, while its trophy radar-guided active protective system (APS), basically a robotic shotgun, can shoot down incoming missiles and drones. This all sounds pretty amazing and cutting edge, right? However, while the AbramsX certainly improves many of the drawbacks associated with the M1A1 and A2 versions, it may not be as innovative as it seems. In 2015, the Russian armed forces revealed the T-14 Armata, a highly secretive next-generation main battle tank based on the Armata Universal Combat Platform. The Universal Armata design was originally intended to serve as a starting point for the next generation of Russian heavy infantry fighting vehicles, IFVs, and armored personnel carriers, AFVs. The T-14 tank iteration is capable in its own right. Coming in at a spry 55 tons, it is slightly bigger but also lighter than the M1 Abrams. Powered by a 1500 horsepower 12-speed automatic diesel engine, it's slightly faster than the Abrams. Costing $4 to $5 million per unit, it's also cheaper to produce, slightly more maneuverable, and claims to have an operational range of 310 miles. If anything, the T-14 may well prove to be a trendsetter. It was, after all, the world's first production tank with an unmanned turret, a design feature that AbramsX will replicate. It possesses a larger 125mm smoothbore cannon, an autoloader, reactive armor, and an active protective system (APS) similar to the one on the AbramsX. Like the AbramsX, the Armata's three-man crew store their rounds in a sealed turret compartment, separate from the cockpit. Likewise, the power plant autoloader and cockpits are sealed against nuclear, biological, and fire threats. The T-14 also has a merged engine transmission unit that can be swapped in 30 minutes in the field, and future variants may be equipped with a massive 152mm gun, which can fire guided missiles capable of shattering armor twice as thick as the Abrams. When it was first announced, the T-14 set the Western world into a frenzy. Could the existing M1A2 Abrams variants hold its weight against the latest Russian main battle tank? On paper at least, it was close. They had similar armament, top speeds, and armor. With its isolated crew compartment, the T-14 may have been able to better protect its operators. It had marginally better range, muzzle energy, fuel efficiency, and maintenance potential, but the robust 40-year-old Abrams design with its modern upgrades would almost certainly hold its own in a firefight. gunfight, which did not bode well for Russia, since by the time they announced the T-14, there were already 10,000 operable Abrams produced and in use around the world. As it turned out, there wasn't much to worry about. Despite plans to acquire 2,300 T-14 tanks by 2025, there are still virtually no Armatas in use throughout the Russian armed forces. As the Armata program was beset by production issues, financial problems, and trial delays, its initial acquisition was scaled back to just 100 experimental vehicles, a number that Russia has fallen well short of reaching. Today, it's unknown just how many Armata tanks are either in production or being tested by the Russian armed forces, with some estimates claiming a mere 20 pre-production units were actually delivered. Can this tank actually be mass-produced, as the Abrams has been? The jury is still out. There are many other unknowns surrounding the project, whether it actually has participated in wargames or live-fire events, whether the 50-ton tank could actually achieve the same level of survivability as the sturdier Abrams, or whether its autoloader system is as reliable as claimed. With the AbramsX incorporating and surpassing many of the design features introduced by the Armata, it would certainly be favored in a one-on-one duel. The fact that the existing Abrams is a time-tested, battle-proven main battle tank, a formidable base platform that will be continually improved upon and upgraded through 2050, is a huge mark in its favor. Already capable of matching up against the T-14 Armata, the fact remains that the price of upgrading existing and already manufactured M1A2s with the next generation technology is far cheaper than producing a new T-14, something Russia can't even dream of as the economic and military consequences of its ill-planned invasion of Ukraine mount. So, could the AbramsX destroy the Russian T-14 Armata? In the end, the accuracy of rangefinders, high-fidelity sensors, and computer targeting would most likely determine the outcome of this tank duel. As one commentator noted, small differences in lethality will likely matter less if one tank is able to see the other, while the other cannot detect at similar ranges. The tank that can find, target, and hit the other one from longer range is likely to prevail in any kind of war engagement. The true difference maker, however, in a fight between the AbramsX and the T-14 Armata would likely not be the tank's technology, armament, or munitions, but in the quality of the crew. This is where the AbramsX, or any modern Abrams model for that matter, would truly shine. Operated by competent, well-trained crews with effective NCOs, something the Russians no longer have, tanks are only as good as the humans inside of them. With a strong emphasis on combined and joint operations, American tank crews would almost certainly benefit from air superiority, better intelligence, and integration with remote assets, not to mention far greater interoperability with their global allies and partners. These all matter on the modern battlefield and will continue to matter in the future. Where these factors fail, discipline, cohesion, and training will take care of the rest. In a notable point-blank tank skirmish during the invasion of Iraq, American tank crews in M1 Abrams tanks destroyed 7 Iraqi T-72s at a distance of less than 50 yards, having never fired live ammunition in their training due to the economic sanctions in effect, something the Russian Mobics might relate to today. The Iraqis did not even register a single hit on their American counterparts. Yes, training, drill, and cohesion matter a great deal indeed. Until both next-generation tanks actually enter the production line, something that for Russia may not happen at all, as recent reports indicate it has halted its 20 trillion ruble program altogether, one-on-one showdowns between the AbramsX and the T-14 Armata will likely remain confined to our imagination. But if you had to pick one, who would you go with? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Back in 2020, Putin made some big promises. By big promises, we mean one specific, armor-piercing, rapidly moving, supposedly impenetrable promise. You know what we're talking about, and it starts with a T and ends with a laser-guided missile explosion. The T-14 Armata. Putin vowed to manufacture this alleged Abrams killer, by far the strongest and most technically advanced Russian tank ever designed, in mass quantities. You can't say the guy doesn't dream big. But sometimes dreams turn into nightmares. And that's exactly what happened to the Russian dictator, who is now facing an incomprehensible shortage of tanks on the battlefield in Ukraine. And we're not just talking about the T-14, which is more or less ghosting this war completely. The guy is running low on every kind of clanky, antiquated Soviet-era hardware and tanks you can think of. The Russian army is currently trying to fight off the latest and greatest Western tanks and IFVs, including American-made M1 Abrams, German-made Leopard 2s, and British-made Challengers, and they are failing at trying to get any real headway in these battles. Would things be different if Russia had more T-14 Armatas at its disposal? In an epic battle between the T-14 Armata and, say, the German Leopard 2, who would win? Let's lay down the stats and find out. But first, a quick review of the T-14 Armata's complicated backstory, filled with red flags that Putin clearly ignored to his own demise. In 2015, the Russian armed forces revealed the T-14 Armata, a highly secretive next-generation main battle tank based on the Armata Universal Combat Platform. The Universal Armata design was originally intended to serve as a starting point for the next generation of Russian heavy infantry fighting vehicles, IFVs, and armored personnel carriers, AFVs. This was a common starting point among the world's strongest militaries in the 1970s and 1980s, but the Russians came to the game late, starting development on the Armata platform in 2009. The thought was that if you could build a modular next-generation tracked vehicle platform, you'd be able to slap all manner of mission-specific systems onto it according to the needs and dictates of the intended mission. Yes, you could have a powerful main battle tank, but you'd also have the basis of a fleet of combat engineering vehicles, air defense units, armored personnel carriers, tank support vehicles, and self-propelled artillery, if you wanted, ones that all run on the exact same engine, fuel, and spare parts. Ultimately, if you could pull it off, it would vastly simplify maintenance procedures and decrease production costs. But here's the problem. Mission modularity is touted as the one-stop solution to all your tactical, technological, engineering, and budgetary challenges. But in reality, universal platforms can force designers to limit a system's maximum performance by imposing artificial fiscal and technological constraints in the name of efficiency and integration. It's okay when the extent of the modularity is limited to, say, the seats on an aircraft, which can easily be removed to make it a cargo versus a passenger transport. But when you scale it up, swapping turrets on a tank chassis to make it an indirect artillery platform in the spur of a moment, there's little chance a universal system will outperform a counterpart which has been expressly designed for the prescribed combat role. Like the rest of the West, Russia has veered away from making the Armata Universal Combat Platform the darling of its motorized ground forces, mostly because it can't anymore. When it was first announced, the T-14 sent the Western world into a frenzy. Could the existing Western main battle tanks hold their weight against the latest Russian offering? On paper, at least, it was close. They had similar armament, top speeds, and armor. With its isolated crew compartment and automated turret, the T-14 may have been able to better protect its operators. It had marginally better range, muzzle energy, fuel efficiency, and maintenance potential than even the American M1 Abrams. But the robust 40-year-old Abrams and Leopard designs with their modern suite of upgrade packages would almost certainly hold their own in a firefight. Which did not bode well for Russia, since by the time they announced the T-14, there were already 10,000 operable Abrams and more than 3,600 Leopard 2s produced and in use around the world. As it turned out, there wasn't much to worry about. The first batch of 12 Armata tanks was delivered in 2015. Despite plans to ultimately acquire 2,300 T-14 tanks by 2025, there are still virtually no Armatas in use throughout the Russian armed forces. As the Armata program was beset by production issues, financial problems, and trial delays, its initial acquisition was scaled back to just 100 experimental vehicles, a number that Russia has fallen well short of reaching. So what's the German Leopard 2's backstory? For one, it had a far more optimal service history since its inception in 1979. It was something of a surprise when the German military started designing the Leopard 2 just a few years after it had come out with the Leopard 1, which had only been in service for about a decade, a very short shelf life for a main battle tank. From the start, the Leopard 1 had been a staple of European defense, with more than 4,700 tanks and 1,741 utility and anti-aircraft variants produced. You can still find upgraded Leopard 1s out there in the wild if you travel to Greece, Turkey, Brazil, or Chile, but by and large, most Leopard-adopting militaries have adopted its more modern counterpart, the third-generation Leopard 2, from Poland to Singapore. Updating the Leopard 1 was a decision made in direct response to improvements in Soviet armor during the later stages of the Cold War. West Germany knew it occupied a strategically vital position on NATO's front lines with the Soviet Union. If the Soviets decided to attack, West Germany needed a competitive main battle tank to resist the threat. Fortunately, they succeeded in developing a tank that far outmatched its Soviet opponents. Ironically, the Leopard 2 began its life as a joint development program with the United States to develop a next-generation MBT. The MBT-70 program that eventually spawned the Leopard couldn't quite meet the requirements of either nation, so the US went off to work on the M1 Abrams, while Germany returned to its Leopard 1 and began asking how they could take it to the next level. Under the management of Porsche engineers, the Germans concluded that the new platform could incorporate improved engine transmission upgrades, a coaxial autocannon, heavier rounds, extendable surveillance cameras, and an independent commander's periscope to improve the crew's situational awareness. While they were there, they decided to beef up the tank's main gun from 105 to the 120mm smoothbore the Leopard retains to this day. The West Germans wanted to see how they were doing so far, so in 1976, they sent a prototype to the US for inspection by American engineers. The Leopard was as agile, if not more, than the American prototype Abrams XM1 in development. They found the Leopard 2 and the XM1 were comparable in firepower and mobility, and that even though the Abrams could resist explosive kinetic energy penetration rounds slightly better, Leopard 2 crews were almost twice as well protected. The Leopard's engine was more reliable. It guzzled less gas, and it didn't have as large of a heat signature, even if it was noisier. The Leopard 2 hit the production line shortly after its American audition, having improved on its armor deficiencies. Like any MBT, it has undergone a series of regular systems upgrades that have improved its armor, survivability, firepower, and optics as technology has improved. There were a couple of baseline improvements over previous generations of MBTs that really set the Leopard 2 apart. It had blowout panels on the separator between the turret bustle, with its ready ammunition racks and the crew compartment. It had new thermal night sight systems, digital ballistic computers, improved fire extinguishing systems, improved frontal arc armor arrays, and side skirts that could add new ceramic and composite armor modular plating as required. The latest version of the Leopard is the 2A7, first released in 2014. A consistent string of upgrades have either been implemented or are scheduled to continue improving the platform ever since, which will be discussed in more detail later. Rheinmetall, the manufacturer of the Leopard and Abrams 120mm smoothbore guns, announced in 2015 that it would begin developing a new 130mm variant that would offer a 50% increase in performance in penetration. While Germany has announced the end of the Leopard's service life will likely come around 2030, and Germany and France are already jointly designing its replacement, the main ground combat system, there are more improvements to the Leopard 2A7 in the offing, including upgrades to the current L55 Cannon 120mm ammunition, as well as a new digital turret core system, situational awareness system, and an active protective system. The T-14 tank is capable in its own right. Coming in at a spry 55 tons, it is 12 tons lighter than the 67-ton Leopard 2. Powered by a turbocharged 1500 horsepower 12-speed automatic diesel engine, the T-14 is actually significantly faster on the road than the Leopard, capable of traveling 56 miles an hour to the Leopard's 43. Costing $4 to $5 million per unit, the Russian offering is also much cheaper to produce, almost half the cost of the Leopard. It is slightly more maneuverable, has adjustable suspension, and claims to have an operational range of 310 miles, 30 more than the Leopard's 280. If anything, the T-14 may well prove to be a trendsetter. It was, after all, the world's first production tank with an unmanned turret, a design feature the latest generation prototype American AbramsX will replicate. It possesses a larger 125mm smoothbore cannon, an autoloader, reactive armor, and the Afghanit Active Protective System (APS) that helps it mitigate the impact of ATGMs that have absolutely eviscerated thousands of T-90s, T-80s, and T-72s that used to form the backbone of the Russian army. The Armata's 3-man crew store their rounds in a sealed turret compartment separate from the cockpit. Likewise, the power plant, autoloader, and cockpits are sealed against nuclear, biological, and fire threats, something the Leopard's crew can also boast. Something unique about the T-14 is that it has a merged engine transmission unit that can be swapped in 30 minutes in the field and, in future variants, may be equipped with a massive 152mm gun, which can fire guided missiles capable of shattering armor twice as thick as the Leopard's. But speaking of unique features, the Leopard has a few tricks up its own turret. Modern combined operations are undertaken across a variety of terrains and geographic features, waterways and rivers among them, The interior of the Leopard 2 can be sealed, waterproofed, and equipped with a snorkel, enabling the vehicle to traverse bodies of water taller than the tank itself. If it needs to, the crew can have up to 12 hours of life support in this sealed configuration, giving its occupants ample protection against the worst chemical and nuclear threats it might encounter on the battlefield. If the temperature rises above 180 degrees, automatic firefighting systems will engage to put the fire out. In terms of armor protection, defense estimates figure that the Leopard 2 had the equivalent protection of 1,840 to 2,920 mm of armor against kinetic energy projectiles, and 2,700 to 4,370 mm of armor protection against chemical explosive rounds. The Leopard 2A6 went even farther, improving the crew survivability with protection equivalents of 5,890 mm to 7,800 mm of armor versus kinetic penetrators, and 9,000 to 11,500 mm of armor versus chemical explosive rounds. Leopard crews can feel safe driving over a variety of IEDs and mines with robust belly armor. Spall liners inside the hull prevent the deadly fracturing of internal armor plates when an explosive projectile hits the external armor but does not penetrate it, something that can actually incapacitate or kill a crew without leaving much of a visible trace on the exterior of the vehicle. The Leopard 2 can fire several different types of rounds. The German DM-33 discarding Sabot anti-tank round would be one of the most common in a head-to-head matchup, capable of penetrating 960 mm of steel armor at a range of 2,000 meters. The Leopard 2A7's new L55 cannon barrel is longer than its predecessor, giving ammunition improved penetrating power. The German tank can fire Leopard anti-tank guided missiles up to 3.6 miles away through the main gun, something the Armata allegedly claims it can do up to a distance of 5 miles, which could be the deciding factor in a one-on-one tank duel. In terms of capacity, the Leopard houses 42 rounds inside the crewed turret, 15 additional rounds on the left side of the turret bustle, and 27 stored rounds in a specially protected hull magazine. The Armata, for its part, can hold 45 rounds. Both tanks have an array of 12.7 and 7.62 mm machine guns in addition to their main guns for suppressive fire against infantry and smaller mechanized targets. Next-generation sensors and optics are the norm in both models, but this is where the proven Leopard shines. It has a stabilized optical periscope for day and night operations, one that integrates fiber optic gyros, laser rangefinders, image fusion functioning, daylight cameras, and a thermal imaging device. The Leopard's gunner station incorporates a stabilized main sight and an auxiliary targeting telescope, while the driver can maneuver the tank into position using the tank's built-in night vision and thermal drive systems. If the Armata actually existed, we would find a capable foe. It possesses multispectral sights with laser rangefinders, thermals, and wide-angle cameras offering its crew 360-degree situational awareness. Its automated fire control system uses an advanced battlefield management system to analyze targeting data using the tank's built-in muzzle reference system and range sensors. This would certainly give the crew a leg up, as long as all the systems could be kept in good working order. The T-14's turret uses electrical armament stabilization and can fire programmable ammunition, like the gun-launched anti-tank guided missiles previously noted, expressly designed to destroy tanks and even helicopters. It's also worth noting that the T-14 is networked for guidance with other T-14s. They can be aided by a drone cable attachment that can be used indefinitely to distinguish targets using day or night vision, infrared, and add distance and target guidance data. This means if one tank's drone sees a target, the others will too. The Armata, as you can tell, is a tank purpose-built for the digital age. Good luck killing its crew too. Its forward-based 3-man crew are tightly cocooned in a futuristic steel capsule developed by Russian scientists to be 15% lighter than normal steel, yet withstand insanely heavier blast and heat ratings. Russian engineers wrapped this reinforced steel crew compartment in layers of classified composite ceramic plating. Russian engineers took things a step further. The forward position of the tank boasts a revolutionary Malachite dual explosive reactive armor system that can offset the impact of an RPG or anti-tank round in the front, sides, and top of the tank. In the rear, bar armor adds a few additional inches of potentially life-saving buffer space between the point of impact and the rear armor itself. Like most modern MBTs, the T-14 utilizes an APS system, with 5 rocket launchers on either side of the tank that comes in 2 versions, hard and soft kill versions. Hard kill systems intercept and disable incoming munitions with projectiles of their own, while soft kill systems interfere with the electronic guidance or stabilization mechanisms of incoming rounds using things like laser dazzlers. The Russian-designed Afghanit system is the first in the world to incorporate both in a single system, using millimeter-wave radar to target a variety of enemy rounds, including kinetic energy penetrators and tandem charge weapons, like the US-manufactured Javelin. It's not been proven to work 100% of the time, but it's pretty good, analysts believe, at deflecting and destroying artillery shells and unguided rockets that are common on the modern battlefield, and interfering with ATGM guidance systems. Some Russians even say it can protect T-14 crews against the depleted uranium kinetic penetrators in common use among American tank crews, but we'll believe that when we see it. Along those lines, there are almost more unknowns than knowns surrounding the T-14 project, like whether it has actually participated in wargames or live-fire events, whether the 55-ton tank could actually achieve the same level of survivability as the sturdier Leopard, or whether its autoloader system is as reliable as claimed. What we do know is that there is a reason American tank crews rely on good old quality German engineering and precision by adapting the exact same turret and barrel configuration as the Leopard 2. The Leopard 2 systems can keep its gun leveled no matter what terrain it is traversing, even if it's on a hilly terrain or crossing a busy road. After firing, the barrel snaps back to its initial position in the blink of an eye. Hold my beer, T-14, literally. There's a famous promotional video showing a Leopard 2 holding a stein of German beer on the tip of its turret while it casually launches itself over an obstacle course, and as you might expect, not a drop spills out. As far as we know, the T-14 has more vertical and horizontal recoil, something you don't see on the Leopard, and is slightly less stable than the German model, which could delay the target acquisition for its next firing. Ultimately, the Leopard has slightly heavier armor, but the Armata is faster, can travel farther, and is much cheaper to produce, though apparently not cheap enough for the Russian MOD. It also has an autoloader with a heavier primary gun effective up to 5 kilometers. Using its 3U BK-21 Sprinter ATGMs, that range increases up to 12 kilometers. Both tanks have not, as yet, faced advanced tanks of their same generation in combat. Yes, the T-14 takes a lot of flack. We laugh because the tank broke down in its first public outing at the 2015 Moscow Victory Day parade. I'm sure Putin would bite your arm off for a mechanically challenged T-14 to parade around these days. He could only drum up a single T-34 for this year's iteration, even though the decision to do so was likely motivated by legitimate security concerns. Still, in a hypothetical one-on-one battle that blatantly ignores today's geopolitical realities, the fact of the matter is that the Russian tank incorporates and surpasses many of the design features that make the Leopard 2 as great as it is. The armored crew capsule and automated turret offer greater protection and lethality. Its next-generation APS system, high-fidelity sensors, and computer targeting would lend it marked but not decisive advantage. But the fact that the existing Leopard is a time-tested main battle tank of over 40 years with a formidable base platform that will be continually improved upon and upgraded through 2030 is a huge mark in its favor. Only the German government and certain foreign buyers know what kind of next-generation equipment has found its way into the Leopard 2A7+, so it's impossible to know how it would fare in a fight. Already capable of matching up against the T-14 Armata, the fact remains that the price of upgrading existing and already manufactured Leopards with next-generation technology is far cheaper than producing a new T-14, something Russia can't even dream of as the economic and military consequences of its ill-planned invasion of Ukraine mount. In the end, the accuracy of rangefinders, sensors, and targeting computers would most likely determine the outcome of this tank duel. As one commentator noted, small differences in lethality will likely matter less if one tank is able to see the other, while the other cannot detect at similar ranges. The tank that can find, target, and hit the other from the longer range is likely to prevail in any kind of war engagement. It would be rare to actually find ourselves in a scenario where both tanks are hunting the other. With the ubiquity of drones and aerial surveillance, tank battles a la Kursk have become relics of a bygone era. Even if the T-14 boasts greater reach, with its laser-guided rounds and rate of fire with its automatic loading mechanism, it wouldn't matter as much as we might like to think. Isolated and unsupported as most Russian tanks have been in Ukraine, The T-14 would be an easy and favorable target to Ukrainian infantry, who would just as soon engage it with a far cheaper Javelin or AT-4 than a Leopard of their own. The true difference maker, however, in a fight between the Leopard 2 and the T-14 Armata would likely not be in the tank's technology, armament, or munitions, but in the quality of its crews, and you can take that to the bank. This is where the Leopard, or any modern Western tank for that matter, would truly shine. Operated by competent, well-trained crews with effective NCOs, something the Russians no longer have, tanks are only as good as the humans inside them. With a strong emphasis on combined and joint operations, traditional Leopard tank crews would almost certainly benefit from NATO air superiority, better intelligence, and integration with remote assets and battlefield management internal systems, not to mention far greater interoperability with other NATO standard vehicles. Ukraine may lack much air superiority, but it will still be receiving training on how to properly employ them from some of the best instructors in the world. Technology and resilient systems matter on the modern battlefield and will continue to matter in the future, but where these factors fail, discipline, cohesion, and training will take care of the rest. Until the Armata actually enters the production line, something that for Russia may never even happen, as recent reports indicate that in the light of recent military setbacks, it has halted its 20 trillion ruble program altogether. One-on-one showdowns between it and the Leopard 2 will likely remain confined to our imagination. But if you had to pick one, who would you go with? Let us know in the comments. This is Russia's next-generation tank, the T-14 Armata, the latest tank from a country that has long prided itself on its armored assets. The T-14 is supposed to be armed with all the latest modern weapons, gadgets, and protective armor, in an ensemble meant to be a clear break from Soviet-era tank conventions which stretch back to World War II's revered T-34. Russia sells the T-14 as being in a league of its own, with capabilities that exceed all tanks of foreign manufacture. Indeed, the tank and the chatter around it gave Western observers the chills for a while. However, this facade is probably not all it's cracked up to be. Here's why Russia's next-generation T-14 Armata sucks when it actually comes to winning wars. Work on the project began in 2010 under the label Object 195. The first basic model of the new tank was introduced in July 2012. The Kremlin publicly unveiled this model as the T-14 Armata at a Victory Day parade in 2015, and the tank is supposed to enter full service by 2024. The Armata has, however, suffered multiple delays throughout its brief history. Thus far, only a single T-14 has been spotted in Ukraine. The sighting came in the village of Mijinskaya in Luhansk Oblast on October the 8th. The unit may have been placed there to serve as a command tank for other Russian armored assets. The Russians may also be deploying the T-14 tank as a psychological operation to increase morale on their own side after having experienced embarrassing defeats, and to send a message to the Ukrainians that they have yet to best their top-line gear. But how top-line is the Armata really? Would it really make a difference in Ukraine and change Russia's ebbing fortunes if it were deployed in greater numbers? On the surface, the T-14 possesses formidable attributes. It has frontal base armor protection of over 900mm in combination with Malachit explosive reactive armor and the Afghani active protection system. If its armor system works as advertised, the T-14 should be able to take hits from any known tank munition, and with Ukraine's lack of advanced tanks, this could prove a problem should the Armata get deployed in large numbers. The T-14's armor is also supposedly resistant against handheld anti-tank weapons like the famous Javelin, which the Ukrainians have used to great effect against Russian armor in the war. The T-14 also boasts a separate self-contained crew capsule that is isolated from its magazine and specifically designed to protect the three-man operating team from anti-tank fire, maximizing its defensiveness and aiding its ability to act as a command unit. Other shielding mechanisms include active defense systems at the front of the vehicle to shoot down common anti-tank weaponry, such as RPGs. The tank also reportedly has stealth features, with its armor having a lower radar cross-section than other tanks in use. But that's not all. The Armata is a quick and maneuverable tank, with a top speed of 75 to 80 km/h in both forward and reverse modes. In contrast, most of Russia's widely used tanks can only achieve a top speed of 4 km/h while in reverse, making them easy to target with anti-tank fire. The T-14 has a remote-controlled turret that loads automatically with a 45-round magazine. The standard gun is a 125mm 2A82-1M smoothbore, but it can be upgraded to a 2A83 152mm gun. Either type can also fire laser-guided missiles. The T-14's secondary weapons include the Cord 12.7mm machine gun or PKTM 7.62mm machine gun. The Armata's engagement range exceeds any Western tank, as it can hit targets up to 12 kilometers away. Sounds incredible, right? Here's the thing though. All of these defensive and offensive features sound impressive, but Russia has proven that it isn't exactly a trustworthy source of information about its own capabilities. In reality, the T-14 has shown itself to be lacking so far, and not all is as it seems. The tank's problems stretch back to its debut, when one of them broke down and had to be towed away for repairs during a rehearsal for a military parade in Red Square in 2015, which would have been one of its first public showings. This proved only the first of many embarrassments. Often those shortcomings included not being able to pay for or manufacture the tank at scale. An impressive weapon means little if you cannot produce it in the numbers needed to shift the balance of power on the battlefield. That only one T-14 has been spotted in Ukraine after 9 months of war suggests a few problems for the Russians in actually using the tank. The T-14 has been plagued by numerous delays since its public debut in 2015. The Kremlin's initial plans to field 2,300 Armata tanks proved unaffordable, and Russia needed to settle for a much smaller total. The Russian armed forces expected the first batch of 9 in 2018, but the Kremlin moved the date back first to 2019 and then 2020. A 2020 report in The Diplomat stated that 132 Armatas would be delivered by 2022, but that has not happened either. It turns out that the company that manufactures the tank, Uralvagonzavod, also had its fair share of problems. The company is 87 billion rubles in debt and needed to cut the pay of its workforce by 21% between 2019 and 2020. These financial problems may be a reason why only 20 finished T-14s exist as of 2021. The Armata's frequent glitches and production delays came before the hefty sanctions the international community levied in retaliation for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Such sanctions will make it even more difficult for Russia to obtain the materials it will need to manufacture the T-14's advanced electronics, among other systems. The T-14 may have all the high-tech features that Russia claims it has, but even if all of it was true and it all worked, it means little if the Russians cannot deploy them on the battlefield. The next-generation tank also means little if it's too expensive and becomes a white elephant, which may be the reason why Russia has been hesitant to use the T-14 in Ukraine until now. The Ukrainians have proven excellent tank killers and capturers in this war. The prospect of the T-14 falling into enemy hands must make the Kremlin take pause, and if you're too scared of losing a weapon system to deploy it, it's not exactly a useful tool. Indeed, because Russia has been unable or unwilling to produce the T-14 Armata at scale, it has instead used its resources to upgrade its older arsenal of tanks, such as the T-72, T-80, and T-90A. There are other problems for the T-14 tank as well, ones which go beyond cost, manufacturing, and delivery. One of the reasons for the delays includes continual glitches in the T-14's software. These glitches came partly because of sanctions that the West imposed on Russia following its annexation of Crimea in 2014. Particularly, a major weakness inherent in the Armata is that its much-vaunted protective crew capsule cannot revolve like the gun turret can. The engineering arrangement means that the tank relies on optical systems and electronics to deliver visual information to the crew. That is not exactly ideal when you can't get your software right, and even if it were to check out, how would the crew react to their electronics being taken out during a battle? Speaking of systems failure, some American Abrams crews who are familiar with the T-14 were not impressed with what they saw. They questioned the emphasis of its supposedly modern auto-loading cannon. When speaking in a 2018 report for Business Insider, they asked what would happen if something goes wrong in the middle of a battle and the automated loader stopped working. How much work would it take to get the breech open and get down in there? Since the self-isolated crew capsule is separate from the turret, the answer is it could take a lot of work. As the United States has seen with the F-35s and other expensive modern systems, sometimes having the most cutting-edge technology means you sign up for a lot more things potentially going wrong, and if anything is true on a battlefield, many things will go wrong. No plan survives the first contact with the enemy. Even if the T-14's auto-loading system works perfectly, it faces another disadvantage. It is slow. Auto-loading may sound modern, but an American Abrams crew with a human loader can actually get shots off faster. They can usually fire their weapons in 5-second intervals at the maximum, and more often than not under 4. According to Sergeant Emmett Fulgham, a tank gunner with 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, who talked about the subject to the military publication Coffee or Die. In contrast, the T-14's autoloader takes 10 seconds or more to load and fire, meaning that its prospective Western opponents can get 2 or 3 shots off for every one that the Armata gets. The Armata may have a longer range, but with such limited numbers and large load times, it may simply not be able to put enough fire down range to tilt the scale of a battle, especially when there will not be many Armatas to begin with. The Armata has supposedly seen limited action in the field, and results have not been encouraging. According to the reports in Chinese media, the T-14 underperformed in its subdued use in Syria. Chinese media blasted the Russians for promoting false combat conditions under which the tank took part, claiming there was no evidence for anything that they were saying. With such praise from his friends, Vladimir Putin must be wondering what his enemies think. For their part, rebel factions in Syria commented that they had not encountered the Russians' newest tank. Other information out of Syria suggests that the Armata's vaunted system of protection didn't work so well. Reporting from 2020 indicated that soldiers wielding anti-tank weapons hit 3 T-14s, with one of them being completely destroyed. If such reports are true, it is feasible that the Armata's defenses do not live up to the Kremlin's hype, and that advanced anti-tank systems like the American Javelin, British NLAW, and Swedish AT-4 could destroy it, even if the crew in their isolated capsule compartment manages to survive the impact to the tank's turret and magazine. Perhaps this is the reason that only one Armata has been definitively spotted in Ukraine. Another problem that the T-14 faces is that foreign countries, even ones Russia has long had arms deals with like China, India, and Middle Eastern nations, don't seem eager to buy it. Russia has tried to sell the T-14 abroad, but it has found no buyers. The lack of foreign interest leaves Russia even more cash-strapped in developing it, since weapon R&D is expensive and foreign investments help to make the final product pay for itself. For example, robust foreign purchases of the F-35 Lightning II helped the United States share the burden in developing that infamously expensive platform. However, with the seeming lack of interest for Russia to buy one of its own assets and its design problems, other countries don't seem too keen on purchasing the Armata. China even claims that its next-generation VT-4 tank is superior to the Armata. The T-14 Armata's problems are large enough to make the Kremlin reconsider its investment in it. Another tank design, which reportedly lost out to the Armata in the 2000s, called the Burlak, is now the subject of discussion in the Russian military. This tank is less revolutionary. Instead, it evolves on Russia's older tank technology to produce a vehicle nearly as good as the Armata. Whether the Burlak reemerges and spells the doom of the T-14 project remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: the T-14 shows us that appearances can be deceiving, and that most modern does not always mean most useful. But what do you think? Does the T-14 Armata have the potential to become the world's greatest tank? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The Soviet Union, and later its internationally recognized successor state, the Russian Federation, have long prided themselves on their tank forces. Russia has the world's largest armada of tanks, with a total of 12,566 units in its fleet. This is a number greater than the combined total of North Korea, 6,645, and the United States, 5,500, which come in at second and third place, respectively. So with all this pride about its supposed tank prowess, why has it been so reluctant to deploy its latest and greatest tanks to the battlefields in Ukraine? We all know about Russia's refusal to deploy its few T-14 Armata tanks into battle in Ukraine. It's afraid of losing them. However, Russia has also been hesitant to send its T-90s into combat too, and it's deployed comparatively few of them in Ukraine. Why? Is the T-90 also a tank that doesn't live up to the stories that the Russians have told about it? Or was the T-90 a marketing gimmick all along? Let's take a look at the T-90, Russia's supposedly most advanced main battle tank that it possesses in large numbers, and its less than stellar performance in combat. Russia's fleet of over 12,500 tanks is, like many things related to its military, deceptive. Of these, only about 2,600 of them are main battle tanks, and of these 2,600, only about 650, 25% of them, are T-72B3B3M, T-80 BVM, and T-90 AM models that are outfitted with modern fire control systems. According to the Pentagon, by the beginning of 2023, Russia had lost half of the tanks it deployed since its invasion of Ukraine, thanks to their outdated designs, the armored fleet's poor logistics and doctrine, and poor leadership. The T-72 tank remains the workhorse of the Russian military, and has been the most widely deployed Russian tank to Ukraine, rather than the newer T-90. The T-90 has instead played second fiddle to its predecessor, and with good reason. This supposed modern main battle tank's origins, the design flaw it inherently carries, and how it has performed in Ukraine scream failure. Let us explain. The T-90 saw its origins in the late Soviet Union, when the Western powers were producing tanks like the Abrams, Challenger 2, and Leopard 2. Soviet tank designers were worried about this development and wanted to produce a replacement for their entire tank fleet, one which could compete with the designs their rivals were now making. However, instead of taking a page out of the West's playbook and designing an entirely new tank, the Soviets based the T-90 on a fusion of the T-72 and the T-80. As it turns out, this may not have been the best choice. The Russian machine builder Uralvagonzavod produced and built the tank, which entered service in 1992, just after the Soviet Union's collapse. It has since been upgraded with the T-90A in 2004, the T-90M in 2016, and the T-90MS in 2017. Russia probably had between 750 and 1,000 of the T-90 and all its variants on hand prior to the invasion of Ukraine. So how was this tank originally designed? Let's start with the basics. The T-90 is operated by a crew of 3. The tank also has an integrated autoloader for its 125mm cannon and a low-profile design. Its secondary weapons are 12.7mm cord heavy machine gun and a 7.62mm PKMT belt-fed machine gun. The tank also boasts a Shatora curtain, an electrical jammer that deploys smoke grenades when a missile targets the tank. Infrared lights are also part of its defensive array, and these are designed to confuse the guidance system of an incoming tank-killing missile or rocket. The T-90 is built with reactive armor tiles, which are designed to explode when impacted by a tank-killing munition. This helps protect the tank from the full impact of an incoming round. Additionally, the T-90 is built with composite armor materials to make it more rugged against conventional ammunition and precision-guided anti-tank weapons. Unfortunately, these armor systems have often proven less than adequate, and when Russia is involved, you can expect corruption too. Just as we saw in the case of Russian body armor, corrupt officers have had a penchant to sell off the reactive armor panels of the T-90 and other tanks because they are valuable in their own right. To replace them, the officers have installed other materials. At first, rumors went around that they had just put egg cartons onto the tank's sides. This was an easy rumor to believe, given Russia's long history of incompetence that included protecting its soldiers with the airsoft version of the Ratnik body armor. In fact, the material in question is a plastic filler called the 4S24 Softcase Era Block. Unfortunately for Russia, this is not adequate protection against modern anti-tank rounds, even if they don't just fly over it like the Javelin does. Russia has tried to develop better defenses for its existing tanks. These attempts include the Arena armor, which made some waves before the war in video demonstrations. In 2021, Russia released footage of the T-72B3 tank defending itself from an incoming RPG-7 rocket by launching an interceptor that destroyed the rocket in flight. The Arena's active protection system was responsible for this and appeared to show promise for Russia as a way to further protect its tanks without overburdening them with heavier and heavier armor. The Arena system rings the host tank with several millimeter wave radars pointed at different angles. If these radars detect an incoming threat, they will automatically launch an interceptor out of an armored silo located on the tank. Unfortunately for Russia, the Arena system proved to be just another marketing campaign and could not be deployed. The Arena system has not appeared in Ukraine at any point in the war. Operationally, the T-90 has a top road speed of 43 miles per hour and has an operational range of 310 miles. The tank weighs about 48 tons. The T-90's weight is about 20 tons less than its Western rivals. One would think this would be to its advantage. However, the additional weight of tanks like the Abrams Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 is usually put into their armor. This additional armor makes them more survivable, which is critical in a world of precision fire and where the first tank to get shot usually dies. Western tanks are simply better protected and more likely to withstand multiple hits, a fact which we've seen play out in Ukraine's campaign in Zaporizhia, where Russian weapons have often been unable to destroy them outright. Rather, these Western tanks have often been damaged in engagements with their crews surviving. They are then sent to the rear for repairs and put back in the fight. At the same time, Russian tanks, which are often exposed in an attempt to inflict disproportionate casualties on their enemy, get killed in the same engagement without adequately fulfilling the mission they were sacrificed for. Before the war in Ukraine, the T-90 had been a popular tank for international sales. International arms deliveries have been one of the few strong points in Russia's post-Soviet economy. Risking those relationships would be the last thing the Kremlin would want to do. which explains the T-90's comparative absence in Ukraine. The T-90's foreign users include Algeria, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iraq, Vietnam, Syria, and above all, India, which has long had a close arms relationship with Russia and operates about 2,080 T-90 tanks. Unfortunately, performance in Ukraine is only one of the T-90's problems that questioned its prospects for further export abroad. India's experience with the T-90s has proven far from smooth. Indian T-90 tanks were spotted with the infamous cope cages near its border with Pakistan in the middle of October 2023, demonstrating that India is not entirely confident about the tank's defensive qualities, for good reason, because India has experience with faulty T-90s. For example, to fulfill one Indian order of T-90s, the Russian mounted older, less protective turrets to new hulls. Russia exported these turrets to its Indian customer anyway because it had pre-built a lot of them and didn't want to see them go to waste. These were, however, more vulnerable than newer turrets. The comparative lack of protection was not the only problem either. During tests, the Indians found that their new tanks' fire control systems and thermal imaging sites could not cope with their country's hot summer weather. To adapt the T-90 to this climate, Russian manufacturers offered to build specialized air conditioning systems for the tanks, but these also failed, and a tank driver fainted from heat stroke, which forced India to shop abroad to find ways to solve the problem. These and other issues have made India reconsider its tank relationship with Russia. As tensions between it and China mount, and Pakistan remains a constant threat, the last thing India wants is faulty tanks that would prove ineffective in combat. Indeed, the thermal sights on the T-90 for the tank's commanders have proven so bad that the Russians were secretly installing French sights. However, because of sanctions, these are no longer available. The new T-90s will come with the same Russian sights that proved so unsatisfactory in India. The T-90 compares poorly to Western main battle tanks partly because, as we said, it's basically just a variant of the older T-72, combined with some parts of the T-80, such as the Irtish fire control system, with reactive armor strapped to the chassis. The T-90 was also not designed with open architecture in mind, which means that it is a difficult tank to keep up to date with modern weapons and equipment. Case in point, the T-90's autoloader can't fire Russia's newer and larger anti-tank kinetic projectiles, the Vacuum 1 armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot. These rounds were designed for the T-14 Armata, but they cannot be reverse-engineered for the T-90 or older tanks. Unfortunately for the Russians, the T-14 has never materialized on the battlefields of Ukraine, so these new anti-tank rounds, which actually pose a threat to the Abrams, Challenger 2 and Leopard 2, have also been absent from the war. If you want to know why so many Western tanks have been damaged but not destroyed, while their Russian counterparts have gone down in flames, this is one of the reasons. Another of the most glaring problems is the T-90's short effective firing range. The tank's main gun is difficult to raise to high angles. The T-90's gun can move up to a range of 14 degrees upward or 6 degrees downward, which severely limits the targets it can hit. As an example, the T-72 and T-80 tanks deployed in Chechnya proved incapable of raising their guns high enough to shoot at rebels on rooftops or behind third-story windows. These rebels destroyed many Russian tanks with anti-tank weapons, while the T-72s and T-80s proved incapable of retaliation with their main guns. Because the T-90 was based on these two tanks, it suffers from the same problems, and it's proving just as bad in tank-v-tank combat in Ukraine. Western main battle tanks like the American Abrams can hit targets up to 3 miles away, aided by greater gun mobility. In contrast to Russian tanks, the Abrams can raise its turret to an upward angle of 20 degrees, or lower it to an angle of 9 degrees, giving it greater range and flexibility. The T-90 cannot do this, so it will lose out at longer range combat. The T-90 is also comparatively deficient in its ability to puncture the armor of opposing modern Western tanks. To safely do so, it will need to get closer to its targets, while enemy tanks can stay back at safer ranges. Obviously, this reality is not advantageous for the Russian tank. Poor doctrine was literally built into the T-90's design. One of the reasons the Soviet planners chose not to go with a completely new design for the T-90 was because they wanted the tank to remain cheap, which its predecessor, the T-72, also was. The T-72 was designed to replicate World War II-era flood tactics and overwhelm its opponents with mass. This design has carried over into the T-90, where it's been implemented in Ukraine to poor results. The tank's cost hints at this purpose, as one T-90 costs roughly between $2.5 million to $4.5 million, depending on the variant, which is much less expensive than its Western counterparts. By comparison, an Abrams tank can cost over $10 million per unit, while the Leopard 2 can cost $6 million and the Challenger 2 around $5 million. This comparison in unit costs reveals the Soviet plans to flood the zone with the sheer mass of T-90s they plan to produce. Unfortunately for the Russians, this mass of T-90s never came. Russia lost much of its tank-producing infrastructure in the chaos of the Soviet Union's collapse. The T-90 was notably absent in the First Chechen War. Instead, the T-72 and T-80 were sent into combat, where they performed poorly. By keeping the T-90 out of the fight in Chechnya, Russia was able to maintain the illusion that it was one of the world's best main battle tanks. The Kremlin went on a marketing spree, pretending there was no need to deploy one of the world's best tanks against poorly organized and equipped rebels in Chechnya. According to the Kremlin, the T-90 was above such trivialities. The marketing campaign worked because international sales of the T-90 picked up. When the T-90 did start to see combat, it performed far below the standards that Russia had made the world come to expect from it. Russia's intervention on behalf of Bashar al-Assad in the Syrian civil war quickly put the T-90 to the test. Just as quickly, footage spread on social media showing Syrian rebels destroying T-90 tanks with old Tau missiles. Bashar al-Assad's army received 30 T-90s from Russia. 5 or 6 of them were confirmed to be destroyed by wire-guided Tau-2A missiles between 2016 and 17. It was a preview of things to come in Ukraine. As early as May 2022, Ukrainian troops proved capable of killing the T-90 with a Carl Gustav recoilless rifle in Kharkiv Oblast. This was the first confirmed kill of a T-90 during the war. According to the Oryx blog, Russia has 2,458 visually confirmed tank losses since the war in Ukraine began. Of these, 90 are T-90 tanks. 34 of the losses are of the T-90A, 1 is a T-90AK, 7 are T-90S tanks, and 48 are T-90M tanks. This data is current as of November 5, 2023. One contributor to these losses is the fact that the T-90 comes with a design that stores its ammunition inside the tank compartment. Once the vehicle takes a direct hit, it and its crew will be blown sky high. Russian tank turrets getting sent skyward in explosions have been a common feature circulating on social media footage taken by Ukrainian soldiers. While most of these tanks have been T-72s, the T-90 is no exception and has met the same fate many times. In October 23, spectacular footage taken by a drone circulated showing a T-90 getting totaled by an anti-tank round in Ukraine. The way Russia has used its tanks has not done it any favors and has instead compounded their design flaws. Russia has repeatedly failed to coordinate its armor with its infantry and artillery, often moving armored columns independently of the other branches of its military. Russian tank crews also tend to be poorly trained. Because Russia has lost tanks at high rates with their crews getting killed in the process, Russian tankers tend to be inexperienced. However, even if Russia managed to find a way to fix these deficiencies, the fact is that its tanks are outdated and incapable of standing up to modern Western armor and anti-tank tactics or equipment. And because Russian tanks like the T-90 are obsolescent designs that are not adapted for open architecture, the Kremlin cannot upgrade its tank fleets like its Western rivals can. In particular, the inability for the T-90s and its older siblings to use the new Vacuum 1 round has put them behind the 8-ball when it comes to dealing with the modern tanks that Ukraine is now fielding. The lack of open architecture is especially bad news for a Russia that lacks the means to create an adequate replacement tank for its older vehicle, as seen in the failure of the T-14 Armata program. After a decade, only a handful have been built, and sanctions mean that it will be challenging for Russia to get the parts it needs to build more of them. As the T-90 and its older siblings get depleted, Russia has been forced to rely on even older designs like the T-62 and T-54-55. With the steady losses of T-90s, T-80s and T-72s, Russia's tank force has gotten proportionally more outdated, while Ukraine's has gotten proportionally more modern thanks to the aid of its Western allies. Perhaps this is one of the reasons that the Russians seem to have surged the T-90 into combat in recent weeks. T-90 losses have accelerated as Ukraine gains more ground in Zaporizhia, which may demonstrate that Russia has more T-90 tanks on hand and is no longer willing to hold them back from action. Russian factories seem to be producing more T-90s. However, these are still, by their nature, obsolescent designs, and for Russia, there seems to be no way out of this conundrum. Even though Ukraine still mostly uses the older, Soviet-era tanks, its arsenal steadily gets more advanced. Germany has announced it will deliver 14 more Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine in early 2024 to replace some of the units Ukraine has lost in recent weeks of fighting in its Zaporizhia offensive. Russia, meanwhile, has no choice but to continue depleting its arsenal and hope that it will be able to bleed more than its enemy will. For all the talk about how advanced it is, the T-90 is merely the latest expression of Russia's traditional way of war, using sheer mass to take more punishment than the enemy can until exhaustion sets in. That was, after all, what the T-90 was designed to do, despite Russia's pretensions to the contrary when selling the tank abroad. The T-90 is far from one of the world's premier main battle tanks. It is instead set into a fixed, obsolete pattern, unable to adapt to the modern battlefield and ineffective against even armed rebels with adequate anti-tank equipment, let alone organized Western armies with top-of-the-line equipment. Russia may be able to win through attrition in Ukraine using these tanks as part of the program, but it will come at a high price for little gain, and the loss of much of its effective land power. The tank fleet has long been Russia's pride and joy, but in Ukraine, it's getting beaten at its own game, and will emerge with far less capability than it had before the invasion began. The T-90 had a lot of hype going into the conflict, but that was all. In the war's aftermath, no matter how it ends up, Russia will have far fewer main battle tanks to call on in any future conflict or to present an effective land deterrent. But what do you think about the T-90 and its results in Ukraine? Is there anything that Russia could have or still can do differently? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button for more military analysis from military experts. Putin has been targeting Ukrainian cities and its civilians since the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war, and recently it's gotten worse. President Volodymyr Zelensky has been upgrading Ukraine's air defense system as quickly and efficiently as possible. But here's the problem. Air defense is super expensive and supply of ammunition is limited. Thankfully, Ukraine's Western allies are on it. Germany recently announced it would be resupplying Ukraine with 45 Leopard or Cheetah anti-aircraft tanks by the end of the year to aid in its defensive struggle against Putin. These tanks are designed to destroy low-flying targets and are much cheaper to operate than other air defense systems like the US-made Patriot. Will they be able to protect Ukraine's critical infrastructure and civilian targets from Putin's missiles and drones? Ever wondered why Putin is targeting civilians in the first place? Here's the thing. In parallel with Ukraine's growing battlefield dominance, Russia has had a more difficult time attacking Ukrainian military units. One of the few ways that Putin has chosen to fight back has been to launch massive and continual waves of missile and drone attacks at Ukrainian cities. It cannot be understated how villainous these attacks have been. According to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, estimates over 9,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed as of June 2023, and more than 15,000 wounded from these and other Russian attacks. Those numbers, though tragic, are dwarfed by Ukraine's own estimates. They say that the civilian death toll in the invasion so far is closer to 100,000 killed, more than 10 times the official number released by the United Nations. For their part, the UN has admitted that the real numbers of civilian casualties will undoubtedly be higher than what they can confirm. Many of these deaths have come from the thousands of missiles and drones that Russia has used to target Ukrainian civilian targets, both infrastructure such as elements of their electrical grid, as well as apartment buildings, hospitals, shopping areas and schools. As of early July 2023, Brigadier General Oleksiy Romov, Deputy Chief of the General Staff of Ukraine, reported that close to 5,000 missiles have been fired at Ukraine, with almost 3,500 of those strikes carried out on populated areas. To be able to defend themselves from such attacks, Ukraine has received some of the best Western-made surface-to-air missile systems, including at least 2 batteries of the very capable US-built Patriot missile systems, which have helped protect Ukraine's capital Kyiv from advanced Russian ballistic missiles. A third battery has been promised by the Netherlands, but its arrival is not expected until later in 2023. The challenge of using the Patriot system is in reserving its expensive missiles to shoot down the more advanced and harder-to-target Russian missiles. Ukraine can't use their Patriot batteries to shoot down every missile and drone that Russia launches, and Russia has been relying more and more on the much cheaper Iranian-made Shahed 136 drone, which costs a fraction of the $4 million per missile that a Patriot battery fires. Estimates are that the Shahed 136 drones currently being deployed by Russia cost as little as $20,000 to make. Even using other surface-to-air missiles like Ukraine's Soviet-era S-300 SAM systems and fighter-launched interceptor missiles can cost Ukraine between $140,000 and $500,000 per launch. In just one night, July 7, 2023, Russia launched 18 Shahed drones from the city of Primorsk-Akhtarsk in the region of Krasnodar Krai. Ukrainian defenses managed to destroy 12 of the drones, but 6 still got through. Because of the vast numbers and lower costs of some of Russia's attacking drones, Ukraine has had to make use of less expensive systems to shoot down these attackers. One of the best responses to these attacks has been the use of an overlooked piece of military hardware, one that's been discontinued by its original manufacturer as being too out of date for the fast-paced environment of modern warfare, but which has still made a huge impact on the Ukrainian battlefield, and has been responsible for saving hundreds, if not thousands of lives: the 1960s-era Leopard self-propelled anti-aircraft system from Germany. Let's take a look at why this Cold War-era piece of military hardware was and still is a total badass. Here's how it started. Anticipating a possible war between NATO and the Soviet Union, Germany began development of the Leopard, the German word for cheetah, in the late 1960s based on the hull of the Leopard 1 main battle tank. The initial design requirements were for a mobile anti-aircraft system to counter low-flying Soviet fighter bombers. Drones hadn't even been anticipated back then, but fleets of Soviet ground attack aircraft were definitely considered a threat. Between the beginning of production in 1973 and the late 1980s, when the Leopard was discontinued in favor of more advanced designs, Germany built 420 hulls and about 430 turrets. The Leopard is equipped with a pair of quick-firing Oerlikon 35mm cannons, which can each fire 550 rounds per minute. Putting a stream of lead like this into the sky has been an effective way of countering the Shahed drones, and their lower overall cost per system, compared to other more expensive SAM systems like the Patriot or S-300, means Ukraine can deploy more and more of them over a wider area of the country, providing air defenses to smaller cities like the recently struck Lviv. One of the reasons the Leopard can defeat these drones is because of their integrated radar systems, which have a reported range of more than 10 miles. Designed to track Soviet-era fighters and bombers, they work even better against the more sluggish Iranian drones. The Leopard can fire a variety of ammunition, including armor-piercing discarding Sabot tracer rounds, high-explosive incendiary tracer rounds, and advanced hit efficiency and destruction rounds. Depending on the ammunition they're firing, Leopard cannons can hit targets more than 3.5 miles away. Ukraine began using the first Leopards around August of 2022. They were first reported officially on the Ukrainian Weapons Tracker Twitter account on August 25th, though they may have been in the country earlier and just not officially acknowledged before then. As of June 2023, Germany has sent at least 34 Leopards to Ukraine and has agreed to send another 15 more in the coming weeks. Germany has promised a further 30 Leopards will be delivered before the end of the year. In addition, other countries that have bought Leopards in the past from Germany are in talks to send more of the systems, including Jordan, which operates around 40 Leopards. As soon as the Leopards were in country, they were rushed to the front lines almost immediately and proved effective at downing low-flying Russian cruise missiles and drones. They have been particularly effective against the Shahed 131 and 136 drones that Russia has been using against Ukraine's civilian population and their energy infrastructure. Because of the relative simplicity of the system, Ukrainian crews have been able to successfully operate the Leopard after only 2 months of training, compared to the German standard of 18 months. One crew around Odessa reportedly downed 10 Shahed drones and 2 cruise missiles in a single day. Inexpensive and simple-to-operate anti-aircraft systems like the Leopards bridge an important gap in Ukraine's air defenses, which includes long-range systems like the Soviet-era S-300 and Buk surface-to-air missile systems, as well as Western-made systems like NASAMS, a jointly produced mid-range air defense system made by the US firm Raytheon and Norway's Kongsberg Defense and Aerospace, along with the previously mentioned US-built Patriot batteries. Missiles fired by those systems are more advanced, but those advances come at a much higher price, and their construction takes much longer to build. These two constraints mean that the missiles used by these systems are relatively few in number. Those advanced missiles are also Ukraine's main defense against Russia's fast, high-flying fighters and bombers, and their high-tech Caliber cruise missile. Ukrainian forces can't afford to use them against every drone and cruise missile. Because Gepards are designed to destroy low-flying targets and the ammunition is much cheaper, they can engage the drones and missiles for which the more expensive systems aren't a good match. There's only one problem with Ukraine's use of the Gepards. The ammunition is made by the gun's manufacturer, the Swiss company Oerlikon, but Switzerland, attempting to maintain its neutrality, has so far been reluctant to allow ammunition to be sold to Ukraine. As of May 2023, the Swiss were still blocking a proposed sale of Gepard ammunition by Germany to Ukraine. As the producer of that ammunition, Switzerland has the right to oversee any sales of that ammunition by countries that have bought it from them. But Norway, newly accepted into NATO, has indicated that it might be willing to send some of their ammunition to Ukraine, while Germany has indicated they might be able to create a new production line to create the ammunition inside their country, with Switzerland's permission, thus bypassing Switzerland's concerns about their neutrality. More recently, some cracks have begun to appear in Switzerland's icy freeze on supplying lethal aid to Ukraine. In early May 2023, the two houses of the Swiss parliament voted to amend the Military Materials Act to allow the transfer of military equipment to Ukraine in the future. This may allow not just the sale of Gepard ammunition, but the possible transfer of some of Switzerland's German-made Leopard 2 tanks as well. In the meantime, Ukraine's allies have been able to source ammunition from other countries. Germany has reportedly acquired ammunition from a Norwegian supplier, since Germany had itself only around 60,000 shells in the opening months of the invasion. The US has also found a new source of both the Gepards and its ammunition from the country of Jordan. The US paid an intermediary, Global Military Products Incorporated of Tampa, Florida, to purchase some of Jordan's Gepards, which may have originally come from the Netherlands. These behind-the-scenes wheeling and dealing should keep Ukraine well supplied with both the systems and the ammo needed to operate them, at least until either Switzerland relents and allows the sale of the ammo to proceed, or when a new manufacturing plant for the ammunition is established outside of Switzerland's borders. Ukrainian data shows that in May 2023, Russia attacked Ukraine with a record monthly total of more than 300 drones, nearly all of them Iranian Shahed-type drones. But by the end of July, that number may be eclipsed, as Russia is ramping up its use of the low-cost attack weapon. On June 2nd, Ukraine managed to shoot down 36 Russian missiles and drones in and around the capital of Kyiv overnight, with 2 people injured by falling debris from the intercepted weapons. To counter this growing threat, Ukraine is working on more technologically advanced methods to stop them, from jamming their targeting systems to intercepting them with defending drones. To provide an idea of how quickly Ukraine is reacting to the drone threat, there were 7 companies able to sell drones to the country's military soon after Russia's invasion began. By July of 2023, that number had risen to 40, and by the end of 2023, the number of Ukrainian companies able to produce military drones, both offensive and defensive, will reach 50. But as promising as these new efforts are, a reliable version of their products may be months or years away. For right now, one of the best options Ukraine has available to it is the Gepard. It's already a low-cost platform. It's been a proven drone defeater, and it's available in good numbers right now. The more Gepards Ukraine can purchase or have donated to them from other countries, the better off their cities and their people will be. So what do you think? Will the Gepards be able to protect from Putin's drones until Ukraine builds up its counteroffensive? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Everyone is terrified of Israel's Merkava tank, and here's why. The Merkava tank, which translates to chariot in Hebrew, is the main battle tank of the Israeli Defense Forces. Its development is a significant part of Israel's military history, showcasing the country's commitment to advanced technology and self-reliance in defense. The story of the Merkava begins in the early 1970s. Following the 1967 Six-Day War and the 1973 Yom Kippur War, Israel realized the importance of having a reliable and potent tank force. They had previously relied on purchased or modified tanks from other countries, but the decision was made to create a domestic tank that would suit their specific needs. The Merkava project was led by General Israel Tal, a prominent figure in the Israeli military. A veteran of World War II and Israel's wars in 1948, 67 and 73, Tal was one of the world's leading experts on armored doctrine. He had played a major role in Israel's victories in both the Six-Day and Yom Kippur Wars by training Israeli gunners to fire from further away than either Egyptian or Syrian tanks could manage. Tal drew his inspiration for the Merkava from the lessons learned during those conflicts, envisioning a tank that prioritized crew safety, had superior armor and firepower, but could still move with agility across the diverse terrains of Israel. One of the distinguishing features of the Merkava is its overall design, with the engine placed in the front, providing an additional layer of protection for the crew compartment at the back. This goes against the traditional tank design, where the engine is at the rear. The tank's structure is heavily armored, and it includes a unique compartment at the back for infantry soldiers, ammunition, or supplies. The Merkava also boasts advanced weaponry, including a powerful 120mm main gun, a secondary 7.62mm coaxial machine gun, another machine gun mounted on the right side of the turret roof, and an internally mounted 60mm breech-loaded mortar. The roof-mounted machine gun can be remotely aimed and fired by the commander from within the turret and traverse to full 360 degrees. Since its initial introduction, the Merkava has undergone several upgrades and iterations, each improving upon the last. The Merkava Mark I, the first version, was officially introduced into the Israeli military in 1979. The Mark II followed in the 1980s with better armor and improved systems. The 1990s saw the introduction of the Merkava Mark III, which had a more powerful engine, improved armor, and advanced fire control systems. The Merkava Mark IV, introduced in the early 2000s, continued this trend of improvements, integrating even more advanced technology, better protection, and improved weaponry. In the decades since, Israel has amassed a store of over 2,220 Merkava tanks, although a substantial portion of these are still older models. The Mark IV Barak is a so-called smart tank, equipped with state-of-the-art computer systems and sensors to assist the crew in targeting and navigation. Brigadier General Baruch Matzliach, former head of the Merkava Tank Directorate, stated in 2017 that the main challenge facing Arma today is the disappearing enemy, which arrives, attacks, and retreats within seconds. He told the Jerusalem Post then that man is not capable of processing all the information when it comes to the disappearing enemy. While comparing the sensors and computer in the Mark IV to the Waze navigation system for cars, he added that, "We understand that we need a real task computer in the tank to fuse all the information together, to present it to the tank commander so he can be able to make only the most important decisions, so he can really see and identify the target and analyze the situation in order to make the decision to shoot or not." As a smart tank, the Mark IV has fused sensors and a task computer that presents the same information to both the crew inside the tank as well as to other tanks and vehicles present in the field. The simplification and sharing of intelligence and information via C4I, command, control, communications, computers, and intelligence, has been crucial for improving accuracy and timing. The Merkava tank has been an integral part of Israel's military operations since its introduction. It's seen action in various conflicts and has proven its effectiveness on the battlefield. Its emphasis on crew protection has also set a standard in tank design, influencing other military vehicles worldwide. The tank has evolved over decades, integrating advanced technology and innovative design features to meet the challenges of modern urban and desert warfare. The Merkava's fire control system is known for its accuracy and advanced capabilities. It incorporates a range of sensors, laser rangefinders, and computer systems to calculate the optimal firing solution, ensuring high precision even while on the move. The tank's gunner and commander have advanced sights and thermal imaging, allowing for effective target acquisition and engagement under diverse conditions, including nighttime operations. The fire control system is also integrated with the tank's navigation system, providing real-time data and aiding in accuracy. The Merkava's mobility is a key aspect of its performance, designed to navigate the diverse terrains of Israel from deserts to hilly regions. It is powered by a robust V12 diesel engine, providing a good power-to-weight ratio and ensuring rapid acceleration and high top speeds. The tank's advanced suspension system aids in maneuverability, and its wide tracks provide excellent traction, even in challenging conditions. The Merkava's armor is another contributor to the tank's success, ensuring maximum protection for its crew. It features modular composite armor, allowing for quick replacement and adaptation to different threat levels. The tank's front has especially thick armor, and the engine's placement at the front adds an additional layer of protection. In addition to its physical armor, the Merkava is equipped with the Trophy Active Protection System, the only fully operational and combat-proven APS against anti-tank guided missiles in the world. The Trophy APS was developed by Israel's Rafael Advanced Defense Systems and Israel Aircraft Industries ELTA Group. Designed to detect and neutralize incoming projectiles, the Trophy system is equipped with 4 radar antennas and fire control radars to track incoming threats such as anti-tank guided missiles, ATGMs, and rocket-propelled grenades. Once a projectile is detected, the Trophy system fires a shotgun-type blast to neutralize the threat. The tank also features NBC, nuclear biological chemical protection, helping ensure the crew's safety in a variety of threat environments. When compared to other modern main battle tanks like the M1 Abrams, Leopard 2, or T-90, the Merkava holds its ground in terms of technological capabilities and protection. While it may not have the same speed as some of its counterparts, its emphasis on crew safety and its advanced fire control system make it a formidable opponent on the battlefield. The Merkava's modular armor and active protection system give it an edge in survivability, something that is paramount in Israeli military doctrine. While tanks like the M1 Abrams have mostly comparable armor and weaponry, the Merkava's unique design features and adaptations for infantry support make it more versatile. The combination of advanced fire control, robust armor, and superior protection systems has a profound impact on the Merkava's combat effectiveness. The high accuracy of its weaponry ensures that it can engage and neutralize threats at long distances, while its armor and protection systems significantly reduce the vulnerability of the tank and its crew. The tank's design prioritizing crew safety means that even if the tank is disabled in combat, the crew has a higher chance of survival, ensuring experienced and trained soldiers can continue to contribute to the defense forces. Furthermore, the integration of systems supporting infantry operations makes the Merkava a versatile asset on the battlefield, capable of fulfilling multiple roles beyond that of a traditional main battle tank. In essence, the technologies integrated into the Merkava tank have proven crucial in its operational success and effectiveness in combat, reflecting a balanced approach to firepower, protection, and mobility. This has not only established the Merkava as a key component of Israel's military might, but also as a prominent example of modern tank design focused on multidimensional warfare and crew safety. Historically, this strong emphasis on crew protection has paid dividends. The tank's front is especially well protected, featuring thick layers of armor, and the engine placed at the front, providing an additional protective barrier for the crew. This unconventional design choice ensures that even in the event of a frontal attack, the crew compartment remains shielded. To enhance its mine protection, the Merkava's floor is reinforced, and the tank employs a special suspension system designed to mitigate the impact of explosions. These features collectively make the Merkava one of the best protected tanks in the world against anti-tank missiles and mine blasts. Another important aspect of the Merkava's design is its rear compartment, which can be used to transport additional troops or carry supplies. This space, situated behind the tank's turret, can accommodate up to 6 infantry soldiers, allowing the Merkava to function as an armored personnel carrier in addition to its role as a main battle tank. This design feature greatly enhances the tank's versatility on the battlefield, providing additional support to ground forces and contributing to the tank's overall effectiveness in combat operations. The Merkava has a proven track record of surviving attacks in various combat situations, primarily due to these exceptional design and protection features. There have been numerous instances, particularly in conflicts with Hezbollah and during operations in the Gaza Strip, where Merkava tanks have survived direct hits from anti-tank missiles and IEDs, sometimes with the crew members walking away with minimal or no injuries. This has also resulted in comparatively lighter losses of both tanks and personnel. During the 1982 Israeli-Lebanese war, for instance, Israel lost dozens of tanks, but only a tiny percentage of those were Merkavas. Even during the 2006 war with Hezbollah, which fired more than 1,000 anti-tank missiles throughout the conflict, the losses of Merkavas were far more limited than older armor. In total, 5 Merkava tanks were destroyed. Of these, 2 were Merkava Mark IV. One was damaged by an IED, and the other was destroyed by a Russian AT-14 Kornet missile. The Israeli military said that it was satisfied with the Merkava Mark IV performance and attributed most of the problems to insufficient training before the war. In total, 50 Merkava tanks, mostly Merkava IIs and IIIs, were hit. 8 of which remained immediately serviceable on the battlefield. The Merkava experienced even more success during Israel's 2014 war with Hamas, as no Merkava tanks were even damaged during the conflict. The Mark IV versions, fitted with the Trophy Active Protection System, reportedly intercepted dozens of anti-tank missiles and RPGs during the ground operation, mostly Russian-made Kornet models, proving to many that it was extraordinarily effective against man-portable anti-tank weapons. However, this is not always the case, and like any battle tank, the Merkava is not invincible. This is especially true in today's technologically advanced combat environments. As the war in Ukraine has demonstrated, small drones with explosives attached to them can be deadly to tanks. This is even true for models as well armored and advanced as the Merkava. As part of its infiltration of southern Israel on October 7th and subsequent murder and abduction of hundreds of Israelis and foreigners, Hamas fighters struck Israeli outposts along the 40-mile border wall separating Israel from the Gaza Strip. Merkava tanks have patrolled the border for decades, meant to stop just such an incursion. But this time, some of them came under attack by Hamas's grenade-dropping drones. Hamas videos depict multiple successful strikes on Merkava Mark IVs. In at least 2 cases, the tanks also burned, showing just how deadly explosive drones can be to armor unprepared for a precision strike from above. At first glance, many speculated that the drone's grenades, which weigh only a couple of pounds, penetrated the thin top armor on the Merkava's turrets. In general, that's how Ukrainian and Russian drones have been destroying each other's tanks in such large numbers. But later experts analyzed the videos of Hamas drone strikes on Merkavas. In both, it seems the drone's grenades struck either the engine compartment in the front of the tank's hull or the ammunition stowage in the bustle hanging from the back of the turret. Such strikes show the limitations of increasing tank durability. Even though the Merkava has some of the most durable top turret armor in the world, not every area of the tank can be so well protected, and a top-down strike on the front of the hull at best destroys the tank's engine and immobilizes it. A strike on the back of the turret, on the bustle, tends to ignite the ammo stored there. So as military analyst David Axe recently noted, a top-down strike on the front of the hull at best destroys the tank's engines and immobilizes it. A strike on the back of the turret, on the bustle, tends to ignite the ammo stored there, but the ensuing secondary explosion occurs outside the turret, not inside where the crew is. All that is to say, the Merkava is better protected from top-down drone attacks than other tank types are. It's not invulnerable, of course, but a drone strike on a Merkava is far more likely to immobilize the tank and spare the crew than it is to take out both the tank and the crew. Yet Israel is also clearly concerned about the possibility of a direct strike on the tank hatch. In the days since Hamas's attack, videos have emerged of Merkavas being modified with so-called cope cages, hardened protective screens, which the Russians began to adopt in 2022 to try and stop Ukrainian ATGM strikes. This again points to the role of the war in Ukraine, which has heavily influenced modern combat doctrine and technology, in what several experts have called a modern war laboratory. Numerous militaries around the world have watched and attempted to learn from different aspects of the conflict, including how to avoid the fate of Russia, which has lost upwards of 5,000 tanks. For the IDF, losing multiple Merkavas in a matter of days seems to have acted as a wake-up call. Mark Kanchian, a senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, told The Washington Post that, "My assumption is that the Hamas attacks gave Israel the impetus to install the cages more widely. It's probably something that they had been thinking about before, since everyone is watching the war in Ukraine so closely." One major question is how effective cope cages will actually be against Hamas drone operators. Samuel Bendet, a drone expert at the Center for Naval Analyses, has pointed out that the effectiveness of extra shielding like this on a tank varies wildly, depending on the type of drone being used. They are generally more effective against quadcopters that drop small munitions, like the drones Hamas used in the attacks against Israeli forces. They are less useful against cheaply made racing drones that are more maneuverable. Such weapons have been used more and more recently to target Russia's Wagner mercenaries in Sudan. A talented pilot, Bendet said, can get around the gaps in the cages and armor, but it's still unclear whether Hamas has acquired such technology, known as first-person view or FPV drones. If it has, whether through Iran or other channels, it's likely to pose a significant challenge to Israel's armored divisions, especially in a dense urban environment like Gaza. Similarly, the protective screens would be of limited use against weapons like rocket-propelled grenades, if fired down on Israeli vehicles from high buildings within Gaza. Sonny Butterworth, a senior analyst at the defense intelligence firm Janes, noted that shields act as a buffer intended to prematurely detonate an explosive, disable warheads used on some rocket-propelled grenades, or, in the case of drone-drop grenades, cause the weapon to simply roll off the vehicle before it strikes weaker armor or fall into an open hatch. None of this solves the problem of fast-moving, pinpoint drone strikes, as any attack with sufficient accuracy will still be able to hit the least armored area of a tank. Even the much-lauded trophy system will fare, as it's likely that the tanks Hamas destroyed in its surprise attack did not have the protection system active. In sum, it's always worth remembering that due to the changing nature of modern warfare, even the best defenses in the world are not a guarantee. But while the Merkava Mark IV still has weaknesses against skilled or technologically adept anti-tank fire, so does every other modern armored vehicle. And there is little doubt that pound for pound, the Merkava remains among the most powerful and sophisticated tanks in the world, with a terrifying reputation among nations. Yet only time will tell if its array of advanced features and firepower will stand up to the challenges of asymmetric warfare in the 21st century. What do you think? Just how powerful and relevant is the Merkava on today's battlefield? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. Imagine trying to invade a country without checking your combat vehicle storage to see if you have enough T-14 Armatas to actually pull it off. Sounds crazy, right? Well, that's exactly what Putin seems to have done in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. You've probably heard it before, but we're here to say it again. Russia is running out of tanks, and it's embarrassing. But wait, Russia's military is supposed to be a force not to be reckoned with. How did it come to this? Is Ukraine so skilled at getting rid of these tanks, or is the Russian army somehow failing at utilizing the ones they do have? Had. Let's find out. Here's where it all started and quickly went from bad to worse. For Russia, of course. In the little more than a year since Putin began his full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it hasn't quite gone as planned. Russian troops failed to take the capital Kyiv, facing extraordinary resistance from Ukrainians, as Ukraine began to receive advanced military hardware and support from Western countries. Russian troops were pushed back into the east of the country, becoming stuck in a devastating war of attrition. In both the war's early stages and current state of gridlock, one of the most notable trends are the enormous losses of manpower and equipment suffered by the supposedly superior Russian armed forces. Nowhere are these devastating losses more obvious than Russia's supply of tanks. And trust us, if you're waging war, you don't want to run low on those. While recent years have seen a number of predictions about tanks becoming obsolete, the war in Ukraine has demonstrated that they remain critical to modern land combat, featuring heavily in operations by both sides. Putin has repeatedly thrown huge amounts of armor into the conflict, hoping to overwhelm Ukrainian defensive positions. As a consequence, a February report by the London-based International Institute for Strategic Studies found that the Russian military had lost at least half of all its entire pre-war fleet of tanks in the fighting, a figure which has only grown in the months since. In just a single day of combat during March around the key city of Bakhmut, Ukraine destroyed 21 tanks, 23 armored personnel vehicles, and 8 artillery systems. And as of early April, experts estimate that Russian tank losses exceed 2,000 vehicles in 14 months, while Ukrainian officials put the figure even higher, for reference. True, Ukraine has also taken heavy losses, with Russia recently claiming it has destroyed more than 8,300 of the country's tanks. However, Ukraine has been working to crowdsource reinforcement tanks from the West, while sanctions and international isolation have forced Russia to dig deep into its stockpiles from the days of the Soviet Union. That's pretty desperate. Unable to obtain the high-tech components it needs to build modern tanks like the T-14 Armata, Russia is now relying on hundreds of 60-year-old Soviet T-62s and 70-year-old T-55s. This is particularly embarrassing for Putin, who has flaunted his efforts to modernize Russia's military capabilities, spending billions in an attempt to once more turn the country into a superpower. So how did this cringy story of Russia's armed forces losing tanks by the dozens begin? The losses started during Putin's initial attempts to seize Kyiv. As Russian tanks and troops poured into the country, General Colonel Alexander Syrsky, the head of Ukraine's ground forces, determined that the Russian columns would need to advance along 2 or 3 major highways to enter Kyiv in their blitzkrieg attack. So Syrskyi organized 2 rings of troops to defend the city, one in the outer suburbs and one in the capital, with as much space between them as possible, in order to minimize damage to infrastructure. He also moved Ukrainian artillery and mobile anti-tank units into concealed defensive positions to the north and northwest of Kyiv, allowing them to easily target the highways and saving them from Russian airstrikes. This strategy proved to be extremely effective, allowing defenders to destroy many of the slow-moving tanks. But it gets better. There have been reports of entire companies of Russian armor being destroyed in deadly ambushes by Ukrainian hit-and-run teams using anti-tank guided missiles or ATGMs. While relatively simple, ATGMs have proved to be an incredibly effective tool for destroying Russian armor. There are several main varieties of ATGM currently in use by Ukrainian troops. One is the domestically produced Stugna P, an older class of anti-tank weapon also known as the Skiff in its export version. The Stugna P's launcher and missile weigh a combined 60 pounds, making it a relatively large and heavy ATGM. It also relies on operator guidance, requiring its operator to keep tracking the target at all times while the missile is in flight. But even with these limitations, videos have flooded the internet of Ukrainians using Stugna P missiles to devastating effect. The Stugna P has a range from 328 feet to 3.1 miles, with a missile flight time of up to 25 seconds, depending on the target's range. It can also carry high-explosive anti-tank or high-explosive fragmentary warheads capable of penetrating modern tank armor. One benefit of the Stugna P is that despite being heavy, it can be mounted on a tripod, covered with camouflage, and piloted remotely on a laptop-like unit from up to 164 feet away. This has allowed the Ukrainian troops operating Stugnas to keep their units safe from retaliation by Russian tanks and artillery. And the system is simple enough for inexperienced operators to quickly become skilled, such as 42-year-old Ukrainian MP turned soldier Tetiana Chornovol. Chornovol worked as a Stugna operator during the Battle of Kyiv, where she and others used a number of hidden ATGMs to throw Russian tank columns into chaos. As she described it in an interview, "We saw tanks appearing and we literally ran to our position. I ran to my operator's case. I switch it on, and I see tanks on the screen. They just entered within the range of my missile. I took aim and destroyed the first tank. I shot it right at the fuel cells, and the ammunition was detonated. The tank literally flew off the road, and now it is somewhere in the road ditch in the forest." We don't know about you guys, but we're pretty impressed with Tetiana. With hundreds or thousands of stories like this, it isn't hard to see why even Ukraine's domestic ATGM system has proved to be bad news for Russia. Additionally, there are 3 main Western ATGM systems responsible for the bulk of destruction to Russian tanks. First is the American FMG-148 Javelin, jointly manufactured by defense giants Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. Ukraine has received more than 7,000 Javelins since the start of the invasion. One of the Javelin's biggest strengths is its trajectory, as its missile travels in a high arc in order to strike the less armored section of a tank at the top of its turret. Javelins can also penetrate even the toughest tank armor, as they are fitted with 2 warheads. A primary charge disrupts the anti-missile countermeasures or armor, while a second charge penetrates and detonates inside the tank. However, this also makes Javelins expensive, at about $200,000 per unit and $78,000 per replacement missile. Cost aside, Javelins have become a staple of Ukraine's defense throughout the war so far, even being turned into an inspirational internet meme termed Saint Javelin by Ukrainian-Canadian journalist Christian Boris. Even as the invasion shifted into its current brutal back and forth of artillery barrages and trench warfare, the Javelin has continued to prove invaluable to Ukrainian forces. But Javelins are just the beginning of our How Ukraine is Obliterating Russian Tanks investigation. Also critical has been the next-generation light anti-tank weapon, or NLAW, designed and produced by the Swedish company Saab Bofors Dynamics. The NLAW is shoulder-mounted, weighs only 28 pounds, has no backblast footprint, and has a firing range of 65 to over 1,950 feet. Like the Javelin, it utilizes fire-and-forget targeting, requiring no target guidance after firing. It also includes 2 fire modes, overfly top attack, or OTA, where the missile uses magnetic sensors to detonate just above its target, and direct attack mode. The NLAW is also extremely practical, as it uses a non-explosive soft charge when fired, meaning it can be safely launched from indoors or enclosed spaces. While less expensive than the Javelin, the NLAW still runs at a pricey $33,000 per shot, but with their larger arsenal of ATGMs, Ukrainians have also gotten very good at mixing and matching, using each system in the tactical environment and situations where it will be most useful. As Anatoly, a member of the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade, currently fighting near Bakhmut, recently told a reporter, "I'm often asked which ATGW is the best, NLAW or Javelin. I will say from experience that it is best to use them in tandem. NLAW is excellent at close range, so it is indispensable when combat action takes place in urban areas like cities and villages, and the Javelin is best at a range of 1 to 2.5 kilometers, i.e. in the open field. Similarly, against lighter armored vehicles, Ukrainians will often now use the domestically produced Stugnas or Corsars, saving NLAWs for strikes on heavy tanks from concealed, often urban positions. That's another 5 starts for Ukraine's fierce weaponry, but we're not done yet. Lastly is the AT-4 anti-tank missile, also produced by Saab Bofors Dynamics, a disposable, recoilless ATGM. The AT-4 fires a single shot at a range of 650 to 1,950 feet. Designed during the Cold War, the AT-4 is also highly modular and can be loaded with a range of different warheads, some of which can penetrate tank armor up to 600 mm thick. Perhaps the AT-4's biggest advantage is its low cost. Each can be produced for under $1,500 and even less in Sweden. While there are numerous videos of Ukraine's armed forces using them to destroy multi-million-dollar Russian tanks. Since the invasion began, Ukrainians have also become more and more adept at using their arsenal of ATGMs, making it incredibly difficult for Russia to make any real headway. ATGMs, NLAWs, and AT-4s, oh my. Yes, Putin has been served a number of reasons to reconsider his invasion plans, but Ukraine isn't done providing him with a few more. Here's a terrifying and reliable weapon they've added to the pile. Another critical but often overlooked means by which Ukraine has wreaked havoc on Russian armor is with the use of landmines. Some of these are from the Soviet era, but the US also supplied over 7,000 shells of its Remote Anti-Armor Mine System, or RAM, in late 2022. The RAM is a 155mm howitzer shell containing 9 anti-tank mines. When the shell is fired over an open area, the tiny mines are scattered across the ground. This means that Ukrainian forces can lay the mines from a distance rather than by hand, without risking fire by Russian artillery. This makes them especially valuable in open spaces, where they can effectively stop an entire tank force. RAM's lethal power was on full display several months later, when Russian armed forces attempted to take the Ukrainian town of Vuhledar. In mid-February 2023, Russian losses due to the mines were so steep that the British Defense Secretary claimed an entire 1,000-man Russian brigade was effectively annihilated in one day. Reports like this make it easy to see how tank losses have become so enormous. But besides Ukraine's growing supply and talent for using anti-tank weaponry, there is another driving factor behind Russia's loss of more than 2,000 tanks, which has to do with its deeply flawed strategic approach to the conflict. Specifically with the backbone of Russia's invasion force, the Battalion Tactical Group, or BTG, a combined unit of tanks, infantry, and artillery designed for lightning offensive operations. As Russian columns were devastated outside of Kyiv in early 2022, it became apparent that the BTG were not proving nearly as effective as they should have been. Most contained far too many tanks and armored vehicles with too little infantry support, so when they came under attack by Ukraine's mobile strike teams, there were not enough soldiers to repel the ambush, and Russian tanks were easy targets. This was compounded by Russia's failure to establish air superiority, which meant it was unable to supply close air support for its tank columns the way the US did in Iraq and Afghanistan. Combined with Russia's myriad issues resupplying its front lines or repairing broken-down vehicles, and you begin to see just how things went so badly so fast for Putin. And because of all the elements above, Russian tank losses have only grown heavier in the following months of the war. During Ukraine's autumn counter-offensive into the Kharkiv region, for instance, Russia was losing as many as 10 battle tanks per day to Ukraine's 2, despite the fact that Russian troops were on the defensive. Most of the tanks destroyed were T-80s and T-72s, which began Russia's critical shortage of those systems. During that same period, Ukrainians reportedly captured over 560 vehicles and hundreds of extra ATGMs. Thus, in the grinding stalemate which has followed, Putin has had to rely on older and older equipment, most notably the T-55s and the T-62s. The T-55 is so old, it literally qualifies as antique. The tank's prototype was first completed in 1945 and entered service with the Soviet Army in 1958. But reports indicate that in March of 2023, Russian troops began moving hundreds of them out of the 111th Central Tank Reserve Base in Khabarovsk, where they had been sitting in long-term storage for many decades. A recent photo showing a Russian soldier posing next to a T-55 somewhere in Zaporizhia Oblast seems to confirm their presence on the ground in Ukraine. The photo also indicates that Russia is sending the T-55s to Ukraine without upgrading them, as the tank in the photo appears to have the same infrared optics that were being used in the late 1950s. Similarly, there is no evidence that the T-55s have been reinforced with modern explosive reactive armor, and seem to be using the same thin steel body plating as they did during the early Cold War. This may prove to be an especially bad decision, since the T-55s also include the so-called jack-in-the-box flaw, which has doomed many of Russia's other Soviet-era tanks. Unlike modern battle tanks such as the German Leopard 2 or US M1 Abrams, which keep their shells away from the crew behind thick armored walls, older Soviet tanks store their ammunition in a carousel-style automatic loader, sitting directly below the main turret and crew. With only thin steel armor, a well-placed enemy shot can ignite the ammunition and easily blow up the tank. As Professor Robert E. Hamilton of the US Army War College put it bluntly, for a Russian crew, if the ammo storage compartment is hit, everyone is dead. He adds that the force of the explosion will instantaneously vaporize anyone unlucky enough to be inside. And that's far from the ancient tank's only weakness. As military journalist David Axe has written, the T-55 is from a generation of armored vehicles before modern optics, autoloaders, and multi-axis stabilization for their main guns, passive infrared optics, and sophisticated computerized fire controls. Essentially, all this makes the T-55 far less accurate and powerful than any other tank on the battlefield today, leaving them as easy targets for Ukrainian ATGMs and artillery. The Soviet T-62 isn't a whole lot better. It also suffers from poor armor and the jack-in-the-box flaw, as well as limited range and firepower compared with any modern tank. First introduced in 1961, the T-62 was once considered cutting edge, even into the 1970s. Many are equipped with either a TSH-2B41 or a TSH-SM41U gunner's sight and active thermal sights, which allow a T-62 gunner to fire about a mile during the day and about half that at night. This is about half the range of most modern tanks, making the T-62 a sitting duck in many situations. In an effort to slightly improve their effective range, Russia has so far pulled more than 800 T-62s from long-term storage and fitted many with 1PN96MT02 analog thermal gunner's sights. These sights are an upgrade from the T-62's original design, but have not been state-of-the-art since the 1970s, and have mostly been long since replaced with digital Sensor-U sights. But since the Sensor-U includes advanced French components now unavailable to Russia due to sanctions, they have had to make do with the older analog sights, making them essentially target practice for Ukrainians. Another huge issue with both the T-55 and T-62 is their discrepancy in barrel and ammunition size. Newer tanks such as the T-90, T-80 and even the T-64 being used by the Ukrainians have the same size barrel and can use common shells. By contrast, the barrel of the T-62 is 115mm and the T-55's is 100mm, meaning both that they cannot use modern ammunition and that they have issues destroying heavily armored targets. Making this worse is the T-55 and T-62's incredibly slow rate of fire. While the crew of a Ukrainian T-64, Leopard 2 or M1 Abrams can fire 10 to 12 rounds a minute, a T-55 or T-62 crew is lucky if they can manage 3 or 4. This reality is likely to get an even greater number of Russians killed in direct battles with Ukrainian forces as they become more and more outgunned. At the same time, Russian tank losses and reliance on older hardware has come hand in hand with catastrophic levels of casualties. The country is so far estimated to have lost some 200,000 to 250,000 soldiers. For reference, that is more than the US has lost in every one of its wars since World War II combined. In response, Putin has been forced to enact conscription, augmenting the Russian front lines with untrained conscripts, hardened criminals, and mercenaries. These troops are essentially forced to attack at gunpoint, and thousands have instead opted to mutiny, flee, or surrender to Ukraine once they reach the front lines. These mind-boggling numbers have also affected the Russian military's ability to properly resupply its tank personnel. Many of the 2,000 tanks already lost were destroyed with their crews still inside, leading to a serious shortage of soldiers with actual experience operating tanks, especially the more modern ones. Ukrainian analyst Alexander Kovalenko was recently tracking the shipment of more than a dozen restored T-72s, T-80s and T-90s to a Russian unit near Svatova in eastern Ukraine. But when they arrived, Kovalenko noticed that the most interesting thing is that there are no crews in the unit who can operate these tanks. Replacement crews for T-55s and T-62s can be trained in a relatively shorter time frame, as they do not need to be trained to use automatic gun loaders or sophisticated modern fire controls. The downside of this, of course, is that Russia now has extremely green soldiers using what amounts to rusting, obsolete weaponry. Down the road, this will create even more issues, as the crews currently being trained will not be able to effectively operate the more modern tanks, even if Russia is able to start their production. This degradation of manpower and training could prove to be an even bigger issue than Russia's dwindling military supplies, as effective recruiting and training will become harder and harder. Long-term, this could spell disaster for the Russian military and perhaps for Putin himself. With no way to replace modern tanks or the crews needed to operate them properly, it may prove impossible for Russia to remain a global or even regional power. The very presence of T-62s and T-55s on the battlefield is an indictment of Russian power and a sure sign that its armed forces are flailing. But what do you think? Will Russia's tank losses be a defining factor in the outcome of the war? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more content from military experts. Russia continues to pour older and older armor into the Ukrainian meat grinder. Is it running out of tanks? The number of tanks destroyed over the course of a year's fighting in Ukraine has been truly staggering. Yet despite premature predictions of the tank's imminent demise, it remains crucial to ongoing operations for both sides. But while Ukraine tries to crowdsource more tanks from the West, Russia has had to delve deeper into its surplus stocks from Soviet times. The country once touting its next-generation T-14 Armata is now sending T-62s into battle. It's not a good look for Putin and his Russian military, once considered the second best in the world. What's going to happen to Russian armor in Ukraine? We're now well over 300 days into a conflict many assumed would be over in a matter of weeks. With each passing day, more and more Russian vehicles meet their doom. Now, more than 8,700 pieces of expensive military equipment have been independently verified as either destroyed, abandoned, or captured. But this is just a minimum estimate drawn from publicly available footage. This number includes more than 1,500 tanks, almost 1,000 of which have been destroyed outright, with the rest either abandoned or captured. Russia deployed just 2,800 tanks at the start of the war, a number that at the time seemed insurmountable for the outnumbered Ukrainians. But the Pentagon recently announced that Russia has now lost half of its main battle tanks. Yeah, you heard that right. Huge losses were sustained during the Kharkiv counteroffensive last autumn, when the Russian army was reportedly losing 10 tanks per day, while the Ukrainians were losing just 2. Jarring figures when you consider the Russians were defending rather than attacking. Paired with the loss of over 110,000 Russian soldiers killed, wounded, and missing thus far, casualties described as orders of magnitude more than the Soviet Union experienced in Afghanistan in 10 years. The American Undersecretary for Defense recently argued that Russia will emerge from this war weaker than it went in. It does seem reasonable, if not plain obvious. Ukraine still has a long road ahead, but it enjoys material support from all over the world. Russia, on the other hand, does not. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to deduce that losses like these simply aren't sustainable over the long term. Pressure is mounting on Putin and his advisors. His once formidable armored force is slowly but markedly deteriorating. How did it all come to this? There's a lot of reasons why Ukraine is massively outperforming Russian armor on the battlefield. Russia's armored foibles derive first and foremost from 2 big factors: Ukraine's national resolve and its superior fighting doctrine. When fighting for independence, you simply do whatever it takes to win, even at great sacrifice. Ukraine has put its money where its mouth is, showing great heart on the battlefield despite dreadful material losses. Ukraine's tactical acumen has been on full display too. At varying points of the war, it has adapted a wide array of tactics to achieve specific operational ends. At the start of the campaign, it chose to employ its under-equipped, outnumbered forces in small, hit-and-run style teams. With Russian columns strewn out on exposed roads lacking fuel and infantry protection, this made the most sense. Small crews equipped with anti-tank guided missiles or ATGMs could travel light until they reached an appropriate range, fire from concealed positions, and light out to safety before they were detected. This tactic played its part in turning the tide in the defense of Kyiv. When Western countries saw how adept Ukrainians were at knocking out tanks and vehicles worth millions of dollars with man-operated ATGMs worth a fraction of that price, they poured even more into the country. Far more accurate than anything the Russians possess. Ukraine's arsenal of ATGMs also came with easy access to Western trainers and advisors who could help their handlers become even deadlier and more efficient over time. The humble ATGM has become a symbol of Ukraine's stubborn resistance. Beyond the Ukrainian-made Stugna P, there are 3 primary Western ATGM systems responsible for dealing an insane amount of damage to Russian tanks. The American FGM-148 Javelin, jointly manufactured by Raytheon Missiles and Defense and Lockheed Martin, leads the way, with more than 7,000 provided since the start of the conflict. The missile's trajectory is its biggest strength, fired in a high, near-vertical arc and descending at blistering speed before detonating around the exposed, under-armored portion at the top of the tank's turret. Javelins can penetrate even the best anti-missile protection systems and armor because they are fitted with 2 warheads, not 1. A primary charge disrupts the anti-missile countermeasures, while a secondary charge penetrates and detonates within the tank itself. Javelins are great anti-tank options, but their unique fire mode comes at a steep cost of around $200,000 per unit, with replacement missiles priced at around $78,000. Halfway through the conflict in the summer of 2022, however, Ukraine attributed between 30 to 40% of enemy tank losses to the British Next-Generation Light Anti-Tank Weapon, or NLAW. Sounds fierce? That's because it is. The NLAW is an engineering marvel. Designed by Saab Bofors Dynamics, a joint Swedish-British venture, the original NLAW project started back in the 1990s and finished in 2008. It was agreed that the finished product would not exceed 28 pounds, would have a small backblast footprint, and could be fired at a target as close as 20 and as far as 600 meters away. The lightweight result packs a heavy punch. Operators can select one of 2 fire modes: Overfly Top Attack, or OTA, where the missile uses magnetic sensors to detonate just over its target at a perpendicular angle, or Direct Attack, or DA mode. The big draw of the NLAW is its ease of use, and the fact that it uses a non-explosive charge when fired, meaning it can be launched from an enclosed space like a room, a trench, or cramped urban environments. They are still quite expensive, priced out at around $33,000 per shot. The Swedes played an important role in the NLAW's development, but they were hardly done there. Saab Bofors Dynamics also produces the one-shot wonder, AT-4 anti-tank missile, which has dealt its own fair share of damage to Russian tanks. The disposable, recoilless, smoothbore launcher fires a single anti-tank missile from a light fiberglass tube at a range of 200 to 600 meters. Designed during the Cold War, the AT-4 can fire heat, anti-structure tandem warheads, extended range (ER), high explosive (HR), high penetration (HP), and reduced sensitivity (RS) rounds, whatever strikes your fancy, some of which can penetrate armor up to 600 millimeters thick. Widely adopted by the US Army as a replacement for the aging M72 Law, it has been in service all over the world. So how is it faring in the Russian-Ukraine conflict? Thanks to the target-rich environment in Ukraine, there is now an ample body of evidence testifying to the AT-4's effectiveness. On January 16th, for example, a video surfaced on social media showing Russia's brand new T-90M Proryev 3 tank equipped with Nikita thermal camouflage burning in the Luhansk region. The $5 million tank had been destroyed by a cheaply manufactured Swedish AT-4 unit priced out at a mere $1,480. You could buy 130 AT-4s for the price of one Javelin, and that is incredibly good value for money. When you add in Switchblade anti-tank kamikaze drones and other anti-tank implements, you start to see why it has been so hard to make armored progress in tight cities, much less across the country's vast agrarian expanses. Ukrainians have grown more and more adept at using Western anti-tank missiles, and make no mistake, there is real skill involved when you factor the importance of target acquisition, good communications, accurate aerial observation, unit coordination, and other contingencies. Artillery bombardments called down to destroy broken or abandoned vehicles have been responsible for at least as many tanks as Western ATGMs, according to one Ukrainian infantryman. The Russians for a long time threw away tanks like they were wash rags, but they don't do that anymore, he said. Now I guess they're running out. Estimates place the rate of Ukrainian tank hits at 4 a day since the beginning of the struggle. That's like going outside and lighting tens of millions of dollars on fire every morning. Not exactly the outcome Putin might have hoped for. This is the chief reason Ukrainians are experiencing massive success whittling down Russian armored battalions. The trend shows no sign of abating. But there's another reason Russia has lost and continues to lose so many tanks, and it has to do with its tactical ineptitude. Russian tactical mistakes continue to mount. Derivative experts argue of a deeply flawed strategic approach from the Kremlin. This goes all the way back to the failed push on Kyiv. For quite some time, the Battalion Tactical Group, BTG, has been the backbone of the Russian military. Comprised of tanks, infantry, and artillery, this combined arms unit organization makes logical sense on the modern battlefield. However, Russia seemed to have gotten the balance of their BTGs all wrong, prioritizing armored vehicles, trucks, and tanks at the expense of the infantry needed to maintain, support, and protect them. Sure, this meant they would have hard-hitting, highly maneuverable units working in tandem, in theory, but in reality, when Russian BTGs came under attack, there simply weren't enough dismounted infantry to protect the armor or the logistic vehicles sustaining them. Convoys were caught in the open, eviscerated by the aforementioned Ukrainian strike teams laying in wait. Hiding in densely populated areas, forests, and other areas, the Ukrainians would fire, then flee to safety, leaving burning hulks of wrecked vehicles in their wake. If the Russians had chosen to include more infantry ahead and around their armored convoys, they would have been better equipped to detect and stop these ambushes. This wasn't the only problem. Russia's tactics were compounded by another fatal flaw. Since they don't enjoy air superiority, they couldn't rely on close air support to protect their armor. On top of that, it seems that they don't often survey the area with drones or aircraft, leaving armor exposed to Ukrainian infantry that are difficult to detect with the naked eye. It was constant, overwhelming air superiority and reliable intelligence that allowed American armored columns in Iraq and Afghanistan to thrive and survive, or at least avoid destruction by the thousands. Factor in the lack of sustainment, simple things like fuel, rations, and other vital necessities running out across the front lines, with the inability to salvage tanks that get stuck and abandoned in mud, and you have a recipe for disaster. Tractor-riding farmers of Ukraine, thank you for your donation. Over time, the attrition of his most experienced BTGs left Putin with no option but to funnel inexperienced conscripts into the fight. Russia is starting to move away from the battalion tactical groups as they realize how ineffective they are, but it's too little, too late. They wasted a massive amount of blood and treasure trying to make it work. and now they are left with undisciplined conscripts who appear more willing to abandon their tanks wholesale than try to salvage them or, barring that, destroying them to prevent them from falling into Ukrainian hands. More Russian tanks are being built to replace their losses, but can they be introduced faster than current models are being destroyed? The simple answer is no, unless they can build 30 tanks and armored trucks every single day, the average rate they are being destroyed. But that's just the beginning of Putin's tank problem. Though we don't often hear about their impact, Western sanctions on Russia have made it even harder to build the tanks and missiles it needs to prosecute Putin's war. Modern tanks are outfitted with a deeply complex array of electronic systems. Computer targeting, special sights, communication relays, everything relies on critical electronic components previously available to Russia only on the import market. Moscow has previously admitted that it was 15 years behind the rest of the world, producing its own semiconductors, which isn't a good look when so many of today's precision weapons rely so heavily on them. While Russia tries to recycle microprocessors from, yes, you're hearing it right, refrigerators and washing machines to rebuild its dwindling stocks, one British think tank claims that 27 types of captured Russian weapons all contained crucial components from 70 Western firms. Inflation has skyrocketed. Unemployment rates are creeping higher and higher as the absence of Western companies are felt. Industries are shutting their doors. Economic targeting of simple choke point components like ball bearings or fasteners by Western sanctions has had a huge impact. It can be the smallest things that are the hardest to find, where there might only be one source that produces them, the American Deputy Secretary for the Treasury said back in October. Weapons manufacturers are now trying to source the components they need on the black market, but in the interim, Western sanctions and embargoes have forced the Kremlin to crack open stocks of its Soviet-era dumb munitions that lack the computer guidance found so effective in today's models. Cannibalizing older pieces of equipment for spare parts is one way to try and stem the tide of armor losses, but it's hardly a good one. Taken together, many suspect these are the reasons that Russia's vaunted T-14 Armata program never got off the ground and onto the assembly line. Once purported to be the next-generation tank for the Russian armed forces, ambitious orders for thousands of T-14s, filed just a few years ago, remain completely unfilled. Russia has its hands so full maintaining its atrophying armed forces that it couldn't mobilize the resources and manpower to build a fleet of T-14s even if it wanted to. It's looking more and more likely that it won't be able to do it for a long time to come. So what do you do when your country lacks economic power, industrial capacity, and military readiness, but has to shoulder the burden of a rich historical legacy as one of the world's strongest military powers? Well, if you're Putin in 2023, it appears that you lean into that legacy. What Russia lacks in the traditional measures of power, it makes up for with acres and acres of Cold War stockpiles. Ironically, now that it has lost so much equipment, we are seeing footage of hundreds of old Cold War tanks pulled from storage, dusted off, loaded onto rail cars, and shipped to Ukraine. Russia has tens of thousands of old Soviet tanks in storage, including versions of the newer T-90s, T-80s, and their time-tested predecessors that make up the backbone of the Ukrainian armored force, the T-72 and the T-64. But footage is emerging of Russian T-62s being modernized at Russian armored repair plants and shipped to the front. These tanks are nothing short of obsolete in the modern era, and they have been since they started to be replaced back in 1975. Which begs the question, why are they bothering with all these Cold War relics at all? A lot of it has to do with how hard it is to maintain newer tanks in storage. Since they operate using more sophisticated electronic components that, as we well know, are more and more difficult to source, it seems that Russia has tried to pull bunches of T-72s, T-80s and T-90s out of storage, only to realize how expensive and difficult it might be to make them combat ready. A fair portion of these were probably mothballed to begin with. As tanks are left in storage without maintenance, they atrophy. Rubber treads and wheels crack and chip, mice chew through exposed wires, armor rusts and corrodes. A true nightmare for Russian mechanics. The humble T-62 was mass-produced with one idea in mind: make it simple, make it good, and make a crap ton of them. Simple designs mean fewer electronics, greater ease of repair, and interchangeability of parts. Like that old reliable 1966 Chevy you have in your shed. No matter how many years go by, it will always seem to start right up. That's the type of tank the T-62 was. The fact Russia had something in the region of 20,000 of these in storage at the end of the Cold War means there are plenty of stocks to draw from. The bigger question is whether or not it's even worth it. Would Americans be happy if the US Army started dusting off Vietnam vintage M60 patterns from storage, slapping on a fresh coat of paint, better comms, and a pair of thermal sights and said, "Go to and prosper"? Of course not. But when has the Kremlin cared what its soldiers think? Repair plants across Russia are now churning out oodles of Cold War antiques. Most of these museums on tracks culled from deep storage that have not seen combat in decades, if at all, and their maintenance records reflect that. Some are being fitted with new engines, thermal imaging, bulkier armor, new comms, better optics, and cope cages. It probably won't be enough to protect their crews from certain destruction. One plant near Chita in Siberia has allegedly been tasked with refurbishing 800 T-62s by 2025. Some were used to defend the north bank of the Dnipro River after Ukraine's recent liberation of Kherson. We don't know how many will ultimately see combat, but we do know the mere presence of T-62s on the battlefield in Ukraine is an indictment of Russian power. Talks to provide the Ukraine with Western main battle tanks continue, but at the end of the day, Ukraine is capturing and repurposing far more abandoned Russian tanks than they will ever receive from the West. If a new Russian offensive is right around the corner, as many experts believe, they'll need to try to conserve their dwindling armored force if they hope to avoid campaigning with a military propped up by scores of refurbished T-62s. As backwards as it might be to say this, sometimes old equipment is enough to get the job done over the long haul. This may even be Putin's diabolical plan. He knows that if the West buckles and does not commit to supplying Ukraine with the armor it needs to continue fighting, waves of Russian conscripts and mercenaries using outdated equipment might just be enough to attrite, suffocate, and bleed the Ukrainians dry, even if it means he has nobody left at the end of the war to celebrate his hollow victory. Let's hope that possibility doesn't come true. But what do you think? Will Russia's continued loss of tanks be a defining factor in the outcome of the Russian-Ukraine war? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.